Conneely, make sure the mobile phones are completely turned off, please. We're here today in Session A. We have two sessions today. In Session A, we're going to be dealing with detailed scrutiny of the Island Fisheries Heritage Licence Bill 2017, which is resumed. As you're aware, we're resuming detailed scrutiny of the bill, and we have two sessions. I'd like to welcome from the Low Impact Fisheries of Europe Life Group, Mr. Jeremy Percy, the Executive Director, Killybegs Fishermen's Organisation, which is KFO, Ms. Norah Parkes, the Project Coordinator, the Irish Fish Producer Organisation, Mr. Francis O'Donnell, Chief Executive Officer, and Irish South and East Fisheries Producer Organisation, Mr. Hugo Boyle, Chief Executive Officer, Irish South and West Fisheries Organisation, Mr. Patrick Murphy, Chief Executive Officer, and Mr. Greg Casey, Consultant. Thank you for coming before the committee today. I'd also like to thank you for sending your written submissions. Members have been circulated with these along with the opening statements. I just remind witnesses that presentations be no longer than 10 minutes in duration, if possible, please. Before we begin, I want to bring to your attention the witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect to the evidence you are to give to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings to be given, and you are asked to respect to parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise or make charges against a person or entity by name in such way as to make him or her identifiable. Members are reminded of long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against either a person outside the House or an official leader by name in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I now invite Mr. Percy to make your opening statement, please.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to the committee. And I apologise because of commitments tomorrow. I have to go after I've answered any questions. My name is Jeremy Percy. I'm the Executive Director of the Low Impact Fisheries of Europe platform, LIFE. I'm also Chairman of the UK's largest fish producer organisation by number, the Coastal PO. I've been involved in the fishing industry for over 40 years as crew, including a spell fishing from Castle Townbear for a couple of years in my youth, skipper, owner, fishery manager and regulator, processor and auctioneer before moving into representation. The Coastal PO exists to serve the interests of the UK's smaller scale fisheries sector, and LIFE works on behalf of the European small scale fleet that makes up 62% of the fleet in Ireland, 77% in the UK and 80% overall by number across the EU. The EU's definition of small scale is vessels of less than 12 metres, not using towed gear. LIFE's definition reflects the diversity and needs of the small scale fleet on a more practical basis, whereby our membership, that covers 16 member states and over 10,000 fishermen and women, is made up of fishers who undertake mainly day trips, use mainly passive gears, have the owner on board and land fresh fish. The size of their vessels varies according to the safety needs and the sea conditions pertaining in their local areas. Perhaps the best definition of small scale I've heard is that it's difficult to define, but you know it when you see it. And that is very much the case for the vast majority of small scale fishing operations in Ireland and elsewhere. Until recently, our sector has never had effective and genuine representation at a policy level, whereas the larger scale operators with greater resources have been able to influence the policy direction of successive common fishery policies over decades. It is no coincidence that the current common fishery policy reform is the first to recognise the value of the small-scale fleet, based on the fact that it was the first time that the representatives of our sector were able to contribute to its development from the green paper stage onwards. The other important change I've witnessed is with regard to the wider recognition of and the need to ensure the survival and prosperity of the coastal islands fleet, and especially the communities that they support. The Heritage Bill that you are considering would provide the vital underpinning policy in support of those island communities around the coasts of Ireland. It is clear from experiences elsewhere that unless governments act proactively to provide the necessary recognition and practical support, then these communities struggle and often fail to survive. It is worth remembering that the boats we are talking about are small inshore vessels who would in all honesty struggle to make an impact on fish stocks however hard they tried. These boats simply do not have the engine power, the size or the ability to carry much gear or indeed fish. These boats fall very well within the LIFE definition of small scale, and despite vessel and gear improvements over the years, can still be regarded as genuinely artisanal in their nature. Whilst this sector may not often show up on an economist spreadsheet, their intrinsic value goes far deeper than that. Whilst our small-scale fishermen may not generate excess profits, they are nevertheless making a massive contribution to local employment, the maintenance of families and often vulnerable communities, as well as providing meaningful employment in areas where alternative opportunities are lacking. They are not only the providers of the very best quality seafood and have unexplored opportunities for adding value in that respect, but their mere presence underpins a very significant element of the tourist experience. There is clear evidence elsewhere in Europe that the loss of even a few small boats can and does have a dramatic impact on the sustainability of tourism locally. They are also, of course, the holders of centuries of tradition and culture, as well as the maritime knowledge and skills that once lost will never be regained. The failures of member states to provide the aforementioned recognition and support to their small-scale fleet, whilst understandable in the past due to the fact that they were not at the table when the benefits were handed out, has been recognised by the current common fishery policy through numerous references to the small-scale sector, to provide a fair standard of living for the fisheries sector, including small-scale fisheries, and endeavouring to give preferential access for small-scale artisanal or coastal fishermen. This is all wrapped up in recital 20 of the common fishery policy that states that small offshore islands which are dependent on fishing should, where appropriate, be especially recognised and supported in order to enable them to survive and prosper. The European Maritime Fishery Fund also requires member states with over 1,000 small-scale vessels, and Ireland has about 1,437, I think, to develop an action plan for the development, competitiveness and sustainability of small-scale coastal fishing. So this is not just about one sector crying out for support. Their particular needs have been finally recognised and enshrined in law. With the greatest respect, the committee has a one-off opportunity to strip away decades of unfair treatment of the small-scale fleet in your islands, rebalance the books in terms of access to the resource, and importantly, without unnecessarily impacting on the larger scale fleet. There is plenty to go around, but without laying the foundations through the Heritage Bill, I fear, and experience has shown, that there will be little effective change to the downward spiral for your island communities and the fishermen therein. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Percy. I'll now call on Ms. Parkes, please, for your opening statement, please.
Thank you for this opportunity to make a presentation on this topic. I make this submission on behalf of the members of Killybegs Fishermen's Organisation regarding the current discussions surrounding the Island Fisheries Heritage Licence Bill of 2017, which is seeking to establish special fishing conditions for fishermen living in Irish offshore islands. KFO fully supports the concept of a special status for island residents whose livelihood is based on fishing and whose permanent residence is an Irish offshore island. The Irish Islands have a proud tradition of fishing and have produced some of our most innovative and successful fishermen for many years. Many of KFO's own members come from such a background and indeed are still closely connected with their island roots. KFO was fully supportive in promoting the special status of islands when the current Common Fisheries Policy was drawn up, as we are aware of the additional and extreme challenges that this environment poses. However, I must point out the flaws in the current version of the Island Fisheries Heritage Licence Bill. The bill in its current format would be in breach of both European Union and Irish legislation, and further promotion without major amendment is pointless and only serves to delay the outcome island fishermen seek. Firstly, a fishing licence can only be allocated to a fishing vessel. It cannot be attached to a person or group of people. An island fisherman must meet all of the criteria regarding licensing that a fisherman in any other sector does. The promoters of the Island Fisheries Bill use examples from around Europe where quota has been ring-fenced for specific groups of people, but this cannot be done in Ireland. In other countries, quota is tradable and often controlled by large commercial interests. But in Ireland, quota is treated as a national resource, and opportunities to fish it are allocated to fleet sectors throughout the 12-month year in such a way as to maximise the benefit to the largest possible number of stakeholders. It is informed by the Quota Management Advisory Committee, which is drawn from the relevant stakeholders, including representatives of the inshore sector, which includes island fishermen. Within this quota management system, there is provision for fishing opportunities for small-scale coastal fishers, which also includes island fishermen. But there is a problem in that those allocations are never fully exploited. Adding a further layer of bureaucracy to quota allocation by assigning it to a specific group of people, in other words, an island community quota, would not in itself improve the situation for islanders. In its current form, the Island Fisheries Heritage Licence Bill could be very restrictive for future development of an island's fishing industry. There is a specific reference to vessels with overall length of less than 12 metres and not using towed gear, which could preclude island fishermen from fishing for species hitherto deemed non-commercial, but which may become commercial, or from scaling up to larger vessels in the event of and facilitated by harbour development and land-based facilities such as processing, packing for export, etc., etc. Also, it is not clear if this bill would limit the island fishermen to fishing within the 6 nautical mile limit of the island where they are resident. That is, the fishermen could not move to other area or fisheries or use any other gear or avail of seasonal opportunities in other areas if they were restrained or constrained by this particular bill. It is important that any special status being sought by the Irish offshore islands does not, over time, create constraints which prevent long-term development of the sector and have a negative effect on the value of their very important asset, that is, their licensed fishing vessel. So, in other words, to sum it up, what I'm saying is I think that a more productive way forward for island fishermen would be to make more of what they already have, look for better infrastructure. This is one of the reasons why they are not making as much as they could be making out of their existing opportunities to fish. And there is an enormous opportunity here for island branding and development of their own specialised products. And I think they use what is already available without wasting too much energy on trying to get something that might not actually give them very much more at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Parks. Mr. Donnell, next, please.
Okay. Thank you. Dear Chair of the Joint Committee on Agriculture, Food and the Marine and members, the Irish Fish Producers Organisation, the IFPO, hereafter would like to take this opportunity to thank you and the Committee for the opportunity to make this submission on the Island Fisheries Heritage Licence Bill 2017. This submission is short in nature, reflecting the consensus of my organisation. The IFPO was established in 1975 as the first Irish fish producer and represents 44 Irish registered fishing vessels. Those vessels range from small inshore vessels to the larger refrigerated saltwater RSW vessels. Our members are dispersed nationally, and we have members located around the entire coast, some of which hail from and are still living on various coastal islands. We have discussed at length the Island Fisheries Heritage Licence Bill, and in particular, we have asked members for their views on same. The consensus is that such a licence would in fact be discriminatory in nature. Persons engaged in inshore fishing that are resident on an island or on the mainland have the same access to fishing opportunities at present. To alter this in any way could in fact be putting a fisherman or woman resident in Burton Port, for example, at a disadvantage over a fisherman or fisherwoman living on Ironmore Island 1 mile away. This same scenario exists around the entire coast. We have a plethora of policy directives around various fisheries to do with track record. The inshore fishing industry is currently very well represented by the National Inshore Fisheries Forum, NIF, who lobbies and argues on behalf of the wider inshore sector. To afford exclusive rights or otherwise by way of a heritage licence would in fact destabilise the inshore sector's ability to lobby as a coherent cohort within the wider fishing industry and would, in our opinion, cause fragmentation and infighting. There is a strongly held view with IFPO members who come from or currently live on islands that the drive to obtain a heritage licence may in fact allow for access to commercial fishing for Atlantic salmon in the future. This fishery has been closed to drift netting since 2006. The IFPO holds a view that if in the future this fishery reopens, that all inshore vessels can enter this fishery and not just those resident on islands. The IFPO cannot support the bill, and it's our strongly held opinion that it discriminates and in fact goes against government policy, which aims at managing all fisheries resources in a fair and transparent way. And just to say in conclusion, we've been always extremely supportive of inshore fisheries, but we don't see a difference between somebody living on an island and somebody living a mile away. We would like to see inshore fishers getting a very, very fair deal around exploitation of resources and quota. And for example, at the moment, there's 450 tonnes of mackerel allocated to the line caught fishery, mackerel fishers, and on average there's only 250 tonnes of that taken up every year. Okay, now I'm not saying that there should be more or there should be less, but that's not even been exploited fully. So we have a strong view on it. We're certainly not against inshore fishers, and in fact a lot of people in this room would know that we, the IFPO, have done many a road trip over the last 5 or 6 years saying that inshore fishers should be better represented, and we believe that all inshore fishers should be represented in the same way and in a fair way. And just due to the fact that you live on an island, I don't think that you should have, if a particular heritage licence affords you rights or extra fishing opportunities that somebody a mile away doesn't have, we would see that as being a big problem. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Donnell. Mr. O'Boyle, you're next, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. The Irish South and East Fish Producer Organisation wishes to thank you for the opportunity to present their views on the above bill to the committee. As with all fishermen, women around our coasts, we recognise the difficulties that islanders face on a daily, seasonal basis to make a living from fishing. Islands are the epitome of disadvantaged peripheral areas, but this is also true of areas of the mainland, which in most cases are just a few miles or less from these islands. One could point out that if the 6-mile zone from the islands described in the bill were applied in the direction of the mainland, it would encompass and include many more fishing families who depend on the same resource as those on the islands do. In light of this, we fail to understand how anyone can support what could really amount to discrimination against those who reside in equally disadvantaged areas ashore in favour of those who live a few miles away on an island. The introduction of non-transferable island quota is referenced in point E of subsection 6 of the section 2. This is ring fencing by another name, and our quota is a finite national resource shared as equitably as possible on a monthly or seasonal basis to all Irish fishing vessels which have entitlement to it. Any ring-fenced allocation has to come out of the national pot, which means that giving more to an island sector means less for their neighbours across the water who fish in the same area with the same overheads. While we would wish more fish and quota for everyone, we cannot support ring fencing or giving extra fish quota to any one group over another. Hence, in the interest of a level playing field for fishing families all along our coastline, we are not in a position to support this bill. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Boyle. Mr. Murphy, you're next, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to defer to my colleague. Mr. Ruth, thank you. Chairman, we want to place on record the appreciation of the Irish South and West Fishermen's Organisation that this bill has been introduced by Deputies Kenny, Pearse and Doherty, and that this committee has taken up the bill with a view to detailed scrutiny of its provisions. And insofar as the Irish South and West welcomes this bill, we believe that significant amendment may be required of the bill insofar as it is presently constituted. Sorry, Chairman, I'm going to. It's easier for me to read off of this than off of this. In order to comply with Ireland's obligations pursuant to the Common Fisheries Policy of the EU and to enable Ireland and coastal fishermen who generally reside in very remote communities to avail of the very considerable discretion afforded to the Minister and to this legislature in regulating small-scale island and inshore fisheries both within and without the structures of the Common Fisheries Policy and within Irish constitutional and legislative provisions outside of the ambit of the Common Fisheries Policy. And I want to make that clear that it is possible for this committee and for these houses to construct a bill that would enable our island fishermen to be granted specific rights to fish outside of the ambit of the Common Fisheries Policy and in waters that are not European waters, in the inshore waters of the state, funnily enough, inside what is known as the baseline. And we believe that in order to properly scrutinise this bill, it is first necessary to understand the exact nature of what we, the Irish people, voted to pass regulatory control over to the then European Economic Community through referendum and Ireland's Treaty of Accession in 1972. We believe that the nature and extent of Ireland's maritime jurisdiction, specifically the extent to which Ireland ceded jurisdiction to the EU in relation to sea fisheries within its maritime jurisdiction pursuant to the Treaty of Accession with the EU of 1972, must be understood in order to craft an act that will underpin economic activity derived from the ocean and confer a modicum of prosperity upon the people who live along our coastline and on our islands. In the longer version of this, I've set out in quite specific detail how it would be possible to construct a bill that would avail of essentially the waters that would be open to island fishermen, so to speak, and to this House to designate, and within which island fishermen and inshore fishermen could derive entitlements to fish, which would be outside of the EU quota system, because the fish, once it's inside the line, it is not a European fish. Once it's outside the baseline and in the exclusive fishery limits of the state, it is a European fish. In the same way as that if we go out 200 miles out, fish inside the baseline is European fish, fish outside in the Atlantic is internationally owned fish. And I think that is crucial and critical to the members of these houses in terms of trying to construct a bill that will confer benefit on island fishermen and I would hope on coastal fishermen as well, some of whom live in equally remote communities as those on many of our islands. As I say, I have set out in the there were two versions sent in to you, Chairman. There was actually an amended version setting out essentially the background and the law as to how Ireland's maritime jurisdiction is constructed, and I'll just deal essentially with what we are asking the committee to consider in the context of the bill. Sorry. In the event that the committee proceeds with this bill, we believe that regard should be had to the following matters. All of Ireland's populated offshore islands lie in waters within the baseline and in the internal waters of the state, with the sole exception, I believe, unless I'm open to correction in this, Oileáin that lies 10 plus nautical miles off the northwest coast of Donegal, with all waters surrounding the island lying within the 12-mile zone limit and within the exclusive fishery limits of the state subject to the Common Fisheries Policy of the European Union. We believe that specific provision should be made for Oileáin in this bill, and if necessary that the baseline outlined in the map attached to and underpinned by the provisions of the Maritime Jurisdiction Strait Baselines Order of 2016, which repeated the Baselines Order of 1959, would be amended by means of essentially changing the baseline as it passes along the coast of Donegal, so that it would pass outside the outer limits of Oileáin and bring Tory into the inland waters of the state. This will place Oileáin Tóraigh within Ireland's inland waters and grant very considerable waters within which to fish to the people of Oileáin Tóraigh, with the distinct advantage that the fish caught and landed from within that zone would not be subject to the provisions of the Common Fisheries Policy, and nor would these waters be subject to the movement of enormous foreign registered sea fishing boats through these waters whilst conducting fishing operations. In certain circumstances, island fishermen will be entitled to avail of a special portion of Ireland's EU fishing quotas for catches made outside of the baseline and within the 6-mile limit, whilst concurrently being entitled to almost unlimited access to fish resources and waters within the baseline, none of which will be subject to EU quotas. Concurrently, many fishermen living in remote villages and towns all along the southern and western seaboards, some in places more remote than the inhabited islands, will find themselves at a disadvantage insofar as although they too will be entitled to fish for catch and land fish resources from waters within the baseline, they will be unable to avail of any special quota for catches made for EU quota species in waters outside of the baseline and within the 6-mile zone. We believe that if this committee is in any doubt, it should seek independent legal advice in relation to the status of fish resources within the inland waters of the state and lying inside of the baseline. And I think that having that independent legal advice might actually be helpful to the committee. And Chairman, I have set out a note in point 6 of the submission on page 10, and I set out the background that in October-November of 1976, during the so-called Cod Wars between Icelandic fishermen and the British, Danish, Dutch, German fishermen, following Iceland's unilateral extension of the limits of its exclusive fishery limits to 200 miles, and in advance of and during a summit of EEC leaders at The Hague, Ireland, together with France, Denmark, the UK, and Germany, extended the outer limit of their exclusive fishing limits to 200 miles from 12 miles in a joint unilateral claim to the fish resources within the 200-mile zones, with a view to putting an end to Icelandic and Faroese pilfering of fish stocks in British waters. This event occurred 6 years in advance of the international community finally agreeing and signing up to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea at Montego Bay. Ireland and the European Union purported to exercise exclusive rights to all fisheries resources within the waters between 12 miles from the baseline and 200 miles from the baseline, and footed the statutory instrument from November 1976 until 2016, when Taoiseach Enda Kenny revoked the 1976 SI and replaced it with another. At all times since 1976, control over fisheries resources lying in Irish waters between 12 miles and 200 miles from baseline has been exercised by the European Union on the basis of these two statutory instruments. And I should say that I haven't mentioned it there, that would be up to the Treaty of Maastricht, when we, as part of the Treaty of Maastricht, ceded control in relation to conservation to the European Union, but not anything else. We in the Irish South and West Fish Producers Organisation question the legal and constitutional basis for the transfer of jurisdiction over these fish resources and those waters to the EU through the sole means of statutory instrument and the consequent granting of enormous wealth from our waters to the peoples of other member states of the European Union. I couldn't emphasise that enough, Chairman. I don't know what the total value of the fish resources caught within Ireland's maritime jurisdiction is in total every year, but it is certainly a multiplicity of the value of the fish resources that Irish fishermen derive from those waters. I would say that we would be less than a tenth of the total value of the fish resources that are taken out of our waters every year. And I've asked that, in light of what I have outlined to you, that since 1976, the European Union has exercised control over waters from 12 to 200 miles. People of Ireland never voted on this. The members of Dáil and Shannon never voted on it. Nobody voted on it. It was simply a statutory instrument done by a stroke of a pen in a hurry in advance of the summit that was held at The Hague when Ireland, the UK, Germany, France and the rest of them wanted to shove out their borders 200 miles and stop the Icelanders and the Faroese and the rest of them essentially taking their fish. And as I say, I would respectfully submit to the committee that that single hole in Irish fisheries law has not been repaired. Now, in relation to the fish that is within the baseline and that island fishermen and inshore fishermen catch and continue to catch every day, most of that fish is declared against Irish quotas. It's subtracted from Irish quotas and is taken into account when quotas are being granted to fishing boats. The fish that is caught inside the baseline is not European fish. It is not quota fish. And the very least that we in the Irish South and West would call for is that Ireland should seek a rebate from the European Union in respect of over-declaration of fish resources taken from these inland waters. The other issue in relation to the waters from 12 to 200 miles is a far larger question that I think requires considerable serious thought on a different day.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Casey. Now, members, Deputy Kenny is first to indicate.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank to all of the contributors today for all your contributions and your submissions prior to that. I'll just briefly go through each one and with a few questions. Mr. Percy, you obviously represent a large volume of fishing organisations across Europe, and for that we're very grateful that you came to give evidence to the committee here today. You have outlined that the small fishing, small-scale sector, which you represent, makes up approximately 42% of the fleet in Ireland, 77% in the UK, and 80% across the EU. I assume by that sector you're speaking of boats of less than 12 metres, and when using non-towed gear as is set out, which is basically the provision which we're talking about in this bill. One of the issues that has come up against us in respect of this, and it's a legitimate criticism, if you like, or point that has been raised, is that quota in Ireland is divided differently to what it is in other countries. That in a lot of other countries it becomes almost like a private entity, and that it's divided out as a product which is then bought and sold and traded. And that in Ireland it is different, that it is owned in a communal way, it's owned by everyone, if you like, and that the nation owns it and divides it out as best it can equally among the various fishing organisations and then down to the fishermen or fisherwomen themselves. In respect of that, I just wonder what your view is in regard to that, and how it's done in Ireland as how it's done in other countries, and is there a huge difference from the point of view of whose hands it ends up in at the end of the day? I'd also be interested in how the new common fisheries policy has been more supportive in recent times, and I know there are several aspects of it that has suggested that the small-scale fishing sector needs to get greater support. And I just wonder, in regard to the new common fisheries policy, how you feel that is being achieved. That is an intention that is set out. Is that outcome being achieved, or is this bill going in the direction of achieving that? In regard to
you have a second. Mr. Percy has indicated he has to leave early. Okay. If we could have asked any other member if they have questions, Mr. Percy, and we'll take that for it, then we'll come back to the other. Is that okay with you?
Perfect. Yeah, certainly.
Any other members have any questions, Mr. Percy? Deputy Ryan.
If I could,
just
one very brief question, and I just came in towards the end of your presentation. I'd be interested to hear if you had the new kind of our evolving common fisheries policy is more supportive for small-scale fisheries. Is it specifically geared now towards the nature of the intention of this bill from a European perspective?
Members want to? Deputy Ferris.
Mr. Percy, I'd like to thank you for your presentation, in particular when you make reference that 62% of the fleet are inshore, or certainly on the smaller scale, less than 12 metres and so forth. Would you agree with what we would argue is that the necessity of doing something constructive in light of the inequality within the fishing quotas of the fishing sector, that unless we do that, that if it keeps going the way it is, that in a very, very short space of time, there will be less and less people involved, and that will be detrimental to coastal communities and in particular to island communities.
Thanks, Deputy. Mr. Percy.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Range of questions. Certainly the quota management varies across member states, and I think it's important when the discussion has verged on what is or is not permitted under the Common Fishery Policy in terms of the allocation resource. It's worth remembering that Article 16 of the Common Fishery Policy says very clearly that it is a member state choice as to how they allocate their quota. And you could actually allocate it in whichever way you so wish. The only requirements are that you tell the European Union what you're doing, not why, but how you're doing it. So there is wide choice of methods for the allocation of quota. And in fact, in a judicial review in the High Court in London, the High Court judge there made it very clear under the Common Fishery Policy that if a member state chose, for instance, not to allocate any quota to anyone in the course of a year, they were entitled to do so. Not that we're suggesting for a moment that should be the case. So there are a number of methods of it, and yes, it does vary significantly. I think the difference you refer to in terms of the effective privatisation, and in the UK, for instance, we suffer significantly from the fact that through a variety of reasons that I won't go into here, the Westminster governments have allowed the effective privatisation of, well, not effective, the real privatisation of quota, which has resulted in well over 50% of UK's quota being in foreign corporate hands. And you can imagine the impact and issues to do with that. I would, however, say, though, that my admittedly not in-depth understanding of the Irish quota system is that you really do have a de facto privatisation, because it is effectively allocated year on year to the same people. There is, to follow up on your sort of secondary question, in terms of the recognition by the Common Fishery Policy of the importance and requirements of the inshore, the small-scale fleet. There is specific references. I referred to one in my talk of the recognition of island small-scale artisanal or coastal fishermen. You prefer to give endeavour to give preferential access to it. The CFP also makes clear in its introduction that the 12 miles is effectively reserved for the small-scale fleet, although if you ask small-scale fishermen almost anywhere in Europe, they'd find that particularly difficult to believe, where large vessels are allowed in some cases right up to the shore. There is also, on the other hand, some concerns that I've seen in the Irish management policy, and in fact your Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, you publish your Ireland's quota management policy dated 2016, and there seems to be a couple of issues with this. Certainly in terms of environmental objectives, and I say this, Chairman, in relation to Article 17 of the Common Fishery Policy, which states very clearly that member states shall, and it says a shall, it's not a may or if they want to also, member states shall include transparent and objective criteria of a social, economic and environmental nature when allocating a resource. There doesn't seem to be within your department's quota management policy any mention at all of any requirement by the department or the POs to address the environmental objectives of the Common Fishery Policy or the Common Management Organisation. And there is no mention at all of any requirement to carry out regular checks on PO compliance. And although I am not, and I stress not for one moment, suggesting that the POs in this country have anything other than the sort of honest, upright approach to quota management, this has not been the case when there's been a lack of oversight of PO compliance. And in Denmark there are criminal investigations ongoing as a result of the handling and management of international swaps that reduced the actual amount of quota that appeared to be available to the fleet. And it's equally the case with economic and social objectives, where you have effectively 4 producer organisations. They land roughly 90%, i.e. they have the vast majority of both quota and landings, and the 4 POs here have an inbuilt majority on your Quota Management Advisory Committee, which effectively hands these national quotas to large fishing companies for the most part for free. So I would say that perhaps you have if not a direct privatisation, you have a de facto privatisation. And one of our main aims as an organisation across Europe is to support, as Deputy Ferris suggested, the equality of opportunities in this respect by not just recognising the requirements of Article 17 and the various comments within the Common Fishery Policy in support of the provision of a fair standard of living for small-scale fishers and others, but also in the implementation of those legal requirements. I just think I've probably covered the questions I was asked.
If I can, sorry.
There's been a bit of interference there from a phone somewhere along the line. I think we're okay. Briefly.
Supplementary. You said, Mr. Percy, in your earlier remarks towards the end of it, that there was enough quota for everyone, for both larger offshore and inshore fleets. I suppose I come from an environmental perspective and a concern that our fishery stocks in general are under stress. Could you explain the rationale behind that argument? Do you think that there is sufficient quotas for both larger, big privatised corporate fleets, as you said, and also smaller inshore fleets?
Yeah, thank you. I take your point entirely, sir, in terms of the overarching concerns on quota. And if you look at the landings of quota species in the North East Atlantic over the last 30, 40 years, there is an alarming decrease in the landings. We're now apparently using 19 times as much effort to catch the same amount of fish as we did 100 years ago. So, of course, we have very significant concerns. And as I mentioned, I think, in my preamble, we have a situation where the small-scale fleet quotas have been unnecessarily restricted through no fault of their own by overfishing in past decades. So, yes, the answer to your question, the big picture is yes, we have a very significant concerns over the amount of fish and therefore quota available. But within that quota system, there is sufficient to go around if you take into account... Oh, I beg your pardon. Sorry about that. If you take into account the requirements of Article 17 to consider socio-economic and environmental criteria, then within whatever quota you've got, then that would perhaps suggest to member states that they should consider whether you want to allocate quota on making a relatively few people very rich or provide a good living for very many more.
Okay, any other members have any questions? Mr. Percy, he has to leave now. Mr. Boyle, you want a contribution? Okay.
Yeah, just to clarify something there.
Okay,
yeah.
All right. And Mr. Donnell as well, okay. Yeah. Briefly, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I would just like to clarify some remarks that Mr. Percy had there about the producer organisations. He mentioned the producer organisations' compliance in regard to allocation of quotas, and also the producer organisations have the majority of quotas. Producer organisations don't actually have any quotas. In the UK, the producer organisations have quotas. Here, it's a national quota divided equally among all the Irish vessels by the department. The department actually hold the quota here. So the producer organisations have no actual input into the quota other than to advise on a monthly basis the department as to what the quotas should or they would like to see the quotas be, but divided equally among all vessels. So there are no cohort of vessels getting any more quota than anyone else.
Okay, Mr. Donnell.
And just to come in and say, just for the record, I mean, it's certainly, we're actually completely the opposite as to what's happening in other member states, the UK, Spain, France, countries like that there. And the Department of Agriculture and the government have been at pains to state that there's no ITQ system in Ireland, there's not going to be, and of course, the 4 producer organisations sit in the Quota Management Committee, but I can assure you that a lot of the time, and in fact, on significant issues, we don't get our way, and really it's always around consensus. And I would have to also say that this process is running in parallel to another process which just finished yesterday in relation to trawling inside the 6 miles. And for example, our organisation have made it absolutely clear in that public consultation process that we support conservation areas for spawning aggregations of fish, nursery areas. There's so much that government could actually be doing in the inshore sector to benefit the inshore fishing vessels and vessels that fish further outside, that possibly that they're not doing, and we have identified that. So I think I think, to be fair and not to be in any way disrespectful, I think that some of the information around quota de facto being owned by companies and people, it's not true. And the other thing is that if you have capacity, if I own a fishing vessel for 20 years and I sell that fishing vessel, any citizen can buy it, can buy the capacity and can actually go to fish. So I don't think that that's the case. Now, of course, it's difficult to get into the industry. It's an expensive industry to get into. But, I mean, people are not isolated, and families don't own it. And the state are very, very clear on that. And they've been making that. I think any time this is discussed in the Dáil around fisheries, one of the first things that is said by the Minister of the day is that the quota belongs to the state.
Ms. Parke.
Along the same theme, Jerry Percy referred to the quota belonging to large fishing companies. In Ireland, the fishing industry belongs to family businesses by and large. You know, there are no big companies overriding everybody. It's almost all individual, small, family-owned businesses.
Okay, Mr. Casey.
Yeah, Chairman, just a few things I wanted to say in relation to issues that have been raised. Sorry, I've completely forgotten your name. So, it's just in relation to the 2013 Common Fisheries Policy, the applicable Common Fisheries Policy at the moment, which says that sustainable exploitation of marine biological resources should be based on the precautionary approach which derives from the precautionary principle, and etc. And it says the Common Fisheries Policy should contribute to the protection of the marine environment, to the sustainable management of all commercially exploited species, and in particular to the achievement of good environmental status by 2020 as set out in Article 1.1 of Directive 2008/56. And then it goes on to say in recitals 18, Union fishing vessels should have equal access to Union waters and resources subject to the rules of the Common Fisheries Policy. And it then has a paragraph in relation to existing rules restricting access to resources within the 12-mile nautical zone. Essentially, they're saying that the rules have operated very well and that they should be maintained. And then in recital number 20 it says small offshore islands which are dependent on fishing should, where appropriate, be especially recognised and supported in order to enable them to survive and prosper. And I have to say that we in the Irish South and West Fishermen's Organisation absolutely support what I said there. One thing I would say in relation to the ownership of fishing quota in Ireland is that although technically the state owns the quota, the fact of the matter is that in certain fisheries the vast bulk of the quota entitlements are owned by and are restricted to a very small number of vessels. And I think that may actually breach at least the spirit of the Common Fisheries Policy.
Which is a different matter. Ms. Parke, first of all, then I'll come back to you, Mr. Percy.
And I just had one further thing to mention on the environmental issue, that the largest single fishery in Ireland, which is the pelagic one, actually works on MSC certified stocks, which is quite, well, it is the best available certification, Jerry, you will have to say that.
Okay, Parke. Mr. Deputy Kennedy, do you want to ask any question before we...
Fine, I let understand these ones.
Okay. Mr. Percy, just to conclude on Mr. Percy.
Yes, I will. Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to respond. I didn't ever say that the quota was owned in Ireland, and I didn't ever say that there were ITQs in Ireland, but I did say that 90% of the landings are landed by the 4PO vessels, and that to me looks like a de facto ownership system. But and I won't get into whether the Marine Stewardship Council accreditation is good, bad or indifferent. They've been challenged on a number of occasions. But this is, I'd like to stress, this is not about sort of them and us per se. This is about providing a fair allocation of a national resource to those who are particularly in need of it in view of their geographical, social and economic situation. Thank you, sir.
Okay, Mr. Percy, thank you very much for your contribution. On this issue?
On this issue?
Yeah, okay, briefly.
Just to clarify that the 4 POs have open membership. Anybody can join any of the POs. It's a right of to join. So it's not that the POs control the vessels, it's that the vessels themselves control the POs, and any vessel, and in our PO specifically, the smallest vessel to the largest vessel, they have the equal rights when they come in to discuss any issues whatsoever with us. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Murphy. On this issue,
well, it's on the issue regarding.
No, we're finished with Mr. Percy now. So Deputy Kenny has. Okay. I cut him off in midstream earlier on. If you wanted to address the other questioners, I'll let you back down. Is that all right?
Okay. Yeah. No. Just thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Percy. Just the Killybegs Fishing Organisation. Thank you for your submission. And you know, you raised some valid points. I absolutely acknowledge that. The point that basically that the fishing licence is allocated to a fishing vessel. That's true. We understand that. Of course, the fishing vessel is owned by an individual. That's the other point in respect of that. So therefore, in essence, while the vessel owns the licence, the person that owns the vessel owns the licence also. So it's splitting hairs, but one way or the other anyway. Really, what this bill is about is providing fishing opportunity. Now, the term, and this is one of the things that we maybe, perhaps later on when we get through this, that we're actually in a stage where we're going through committee stage with this bill, we may look at amendments, and every bill needs amendments, and one of those amendments may be to bring clarity to this, because the very name of the bill, called the Heritage Fishing Licence, came from a previous committee in 2014, which had a report which stated there should be a Heritage Fishing Licence. Now, maybe the word licence confuses people, because there's already a licence for a boat. We understand that. But this is about creating fishing opportunity. And the term licence has been applied because it was applied in the past to it. So, you know, we just, not to mix that up. Really, the issue here, and you know, the point has been made by several contributors as well, that the people on the islands, depending on fishing, have a difficult situation, and many people living on the shoreline beside them have a similar difficult situation. The reality is that we all acknowledge that. But what we're not talking about doing is giving an advantage to one over another. We're talking about recognising that there is a huge disadvantage to living on an island. The person that lives on an island does not have the same opportunities for access to other employment that they may have if they lived on the shoreline. I spoke to a man the other day in Donegal town who told me he had grown up on the island and had fished on an island as a young man, and he left the island and went and lived on the mainland, and then he ended up working in a textile factory. He said, if I lived on the island, he said, I'd still have to fish because there'd be no textile factory on the island. And that's the reality for people who live on the island. They have a geographical disadvantage because of where they live, and therefore the only economic opportunity that they have is fishing, by and large, because it's the only natural resource that surrounds them. And that's what the essence of this bill is about. It's about recognising that. And it's not just that we recognise it here, but it's recognised internationally, and it's recognised in the Common Fisheries Policy. It's there, in black and white. So really what we're trying to do is not to disadvantage anyone, but to recognise the disadvantage that island people are already at, and in that, to allow them the opportunity to get fishing. And for the opportunity to fish, the first thing they need is they need quota. And in order to get quota, my understanding is that they have to have track record. Now, for an awful lot of the people living on the islands, to get track record is something that happened in the past. It's almost like those of us who will be more used to the farming here in this part of in this committee, we'd look at what we call the reference years when people wanted to get the entitlements For to farm, they had to have certain reference years. If you weren't farming in those reference years, you didn't get entitlements. And it's almost the same with the fishing. So what we want to do is we want to create a situation where there's opportunity to fish and where there's a piece of quota set out for the island fishermen, organised in a similar way to the POs already organise it for their own members, except for the island fishermen, which they will have an opportunity to do that. The points that you raise are valid, and we will look at that, and we will look at clarifying that issue around the licensing, certainly, and we would also look at the issue around the quota management. And I would like to, particularly I think the KFO, because the KFO is one of the larger fishing organisations, and in fairness, I think is probably recognised as being the best organised and has done a great job for their members, and everyone understands that. And I just would like to get a little bit of information around the KFO in respect of that. How many members do you presently have? You know, how many tonnes of pelagic species do you have quota for? And just information like that is I think, would be useful to put context into what we're talking about here. Well, I have other questions for the other.
No, we'll put all these together now because just Mr. Okay. The other gentleman had to leave here. That's why you just got him out of the way first of all. So
thank you.
If you want to complete your question,
thank you, Chairman. Yeah. Just if I can also ask Mr. Donnell in regard to the point that you make, that you feel that in order to attribute advantage to the island fisherman, I think yes, we want to give an advantage to the island fisherman. That's what we want to do. That's the essence of what we do. And it is not in any way to disadvantage the other person who lives on the shoreline. Other issues were raised as well in regard to that somehow or other, that if a person had access to fishing opportunity on the island, that it could run into unforeseen problems down the line. That, in other words, that they would somehow or other be prevented from receiving quota in the normal circumstances. That's not the intention of the bill. The bill doesn't intend to do that. We want to ensure that everyone who would have access to the heritage fishing licence, first of all, they would have to have a licence to fish. So they'd have to already have a licence to fish. They probably would not have quota, and that's why they would seek to the heritage licence in order to gain quota. That's really what this is about. I think the points that you make, that putting an advantage to one somehow disadvantages the other, in a situation where we all recognise and where it's internationally recognised, and it's even in the common fisheries policy, that people who live on islands are already at a disadvantage, giving them a particular advantage is simply about trying to restore some form of equity to their opportunity to create an economic viability for themselves and their families to continue living on the islands. That's what we want to do. And I absolutely understand that your members, and many of them live on islands, would understand that. And I'm sure the people who are also your members who live on the mainland would not begrudge that small opportunity to those who live on the islands. I don't think they would, in fairness. In fairness, I don't think they would, nor should they. The issue was raised, and I know Mr. Boyle raised the issue in regard to south and east, yes. It's similar about the ring fencing of quota. You could call it that. You could call it ring fencing, if that's the term you want to use for it. Yes, that's what we want to do. We want to give an advantage to the people who live on the island because their very existence living on an offshore island is a disadvantage that needs to be addressed. That's what we want to do. And we make no apology for wanting to do that. And again, the same point is to be made. I do not believe that those in the inshore sector who live on the mainland would begrudge that small advantage being given to people who are already living in a disadvantaged circumstances. The idea that somehow or other it creates an unlevel playing field, I don't think is a fair criticism of the bill. I don't think it's a fair criticism of the bill. I don't think it creates an unlevel playing field. I think what it does is it attempts to level the playing field for those who are at disadvantage already. The issues that we have in regard to the baseline and where the baseline runs, and I absolutely take the point. The baseline running around the various headlands around the island of Ireland, and that everything in from that is not EU waters. There is an argument to be made around that, absolutely.
It's not, sorry.
I'll let you back in a minute.
Yeah, okay.
There is an argument to be made around that. I absolutely accept that, and it's something that, in the context of this bill, we could get down that track. But I don't think it's an appropriate track to go down, with due respect. I absolutely agree with you, but I think in the context of this bill, what we need to do is we need to get this over the line. We need to put in place something that deals with the disadvantage that island fishermen have suffered for too long. Find a piece of quota which will work for them under their circumstances, which is tiny in comparison to the overall. And at a later stage, I do believe that it's something the committee needs to look at in the wider context of the EU's authority over our national waters and over the waters that lie inside the baseline. What we're talking about here is waters that lie outside the baseline in the 6 mile zone, by and large. And I think, if we get into something very technical around something around that, we could go down a cul-de-sac that could delay the speedy process and proper process of this bill. So I would, with due respect, while I absolutely understand the point you're coming from and appreciate the points you're making, I just don't think it's a place we can go at this point in time. And I absolutely understand that you are supporting the bill and supporting the concept of the bill, and we appreciate that. I leave it at that, Chairman. And
thanks, Deputy. Deputy McConnell is next now, please, and then we'll come back to Deputy Ferris afterwards.
Thank you, Chairperson, and thanks to all the representatives for coming in today to give their perspective on this bill. I suppose just a general question at the outset, and it follows on from what Deputy Kenny has been saying. I know the arguments have been made by a number of you today that while you recognise the need and the difficulties facing island fishermen, that there is also a similar difficulty for fishermen and smaller fishermen in particular who are on land but who fish inshore, and that to give a particular leeway and specific allocation to island fishermen would be such to discriminate against those who are on the mainland but also fishing the same waters. And I understand the point you're making. However, I mean, would you not agree, and I suppose it comes down to the key core and principle in this bill, that there is additional challenges and particular difficulties for those who are based in the islands and fishing from the islands, and that the opportunities are even more limited on the islands, and as a result, would there not be a case for bringing in specific allocations as is allocated on this bill? I think that sort of goes to the core of many of the points which were made in submissions today. A couple of specific points just from to a couple of our presentations to Norah Parke in relation to the KFO. I know you, just in relation to your presentation, you indicated that you believe there are flaws in the current version of the Irish Fisheries Heritage Bill, and in its current form it would be a breach of both European Union and Irish legislation, and further promotion without major amendment would be pointless and serve to delay an outcome for island fishermen. And you're saying that on the basis that a fishing licence can only be allocated to a fishing vessel and can't be attached to a person or a specific group of people. And you say that although there are examples at European level where quota has been ring-fenced for specific groups of people, this cannot be done in Ireland. Is it not possible that that could be changed from an Irish perspective, where there to be a will there for that to happen? I know it's not the way it's done at the moment, but should the will be there, I'd just like to clarify from you if that is something that could change. And then in relation to Francis Donnell and the IFPO, you make the point just in relation to, you state that there's a strongly held view by FPO members who come from or currently live on islands that the drive to obtain a heritage licence may in fact allow for access to commercial fishing for Atlantic salmon in the future. And you indicate that were it to open again, it should be open to inshore or to island-based or to mainland-based fishermen working the inshore as well as to island-based. I'd just like you to flesh out more why you're saying that and making that particular point, and where your members are coming from on that.
Deputy Ferris.
Look, and I thank everybody for their presentations. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Francie, you said that you represent 44 votes.
That's it. Deputy Pearse.
Yeah. And the KFO 23 votes.
Oh, no, more than 23. But I think in about 40. The 23 would be our RSW pelagic fleet.
Okay. Right. And the big thing here is, and I think the big that's coming across to me is that there seems to be a reluctance to give any bit of quota to this island fisherman or the small person. I'm quite sure that, you know, if everybody sat down and looked at the benefits it would be to a disadvantaged area, that most people would consider it a good thing to do. So we have to find a mechanism here. I can understand your concerns and so forth. I can also say that we can find amendments to this bill that would be able to maybe get people over the line on it. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do here is to try to right a wrong. And Deputy Kenny put it very well. He said the island, if you're living in an island, you are doubly discriminated against. The very fact that you don't have access to onshore jobs and so forth, you live on an island, and it's very, very dependent. And a lot of, my memory is right, I was involved in the commercial side fishing, a lot of allocations of quota was based on track record. And track record goes back to people, and yeah, everybody here knows what I'm talking about. It's not about track record. And most people I know that was involved in fishing didn't have a track record because they didn't declare it. And that's the reality of it. They didn't declare, and they didn't declare it for obvious reasons, because there were people that were struggling to make a few bob, and if they were declaring what they were catching and so forth, you had the taxman knocking at the door. They were going to, and you know that. You know that. And you also know that there was a nod and a wink to people to declare a track record so that they would be able to be the beneficiaries down the road. And that's what happened. I know all the coastline, from Arden South right around to down to Hookhead. I fished all those areas, so I know the fishing community, and that's what happened. And people, you know, it's people. There's very, very wealthy people out of fishing, making an absolute fortune out of it, and good luck to them. You know, the people involved in the sector that are multi-millionaires. But what we're trying to do here is try to look after the small person. And I would like to see another bill coming through looking after the inshore person, people inshore people who are involved and equally discriminated against, and equally have had have find themselves with no quota, no chance of quota. And I'm very impressed with what Greg Casey said, and we shouldn't lose sight of it about the baseline and the fish inside the baseline. That this is not EU fish. This is fish that belongs to the Irish nation and should be for the benefit of the Irish nation. But a lot of that fish is finding its way into part of the EU quota. So that's for another day. But I think the contribution here, certainly this committee should be looking about doing a separate meeting on the baseline to the shore and the fish that is got there. For another day, yeah. But I'm making a point, and I think it is. Yeah, that's right. Now, another thing is that a point being made. I think Mr. Boyle made it there about government allocate quota. Yeah, allocate quota, and they can reallocate quota, and they can change if for the common good they can do things if they so wish to do so. And maybe that's a way we can find some little bit to give the island communities. 1%? 1% out of a multi-million industry to about 40 boats, 40 people involved in our islands, maybe up to 50 at most. What would be wrong with that? I think you need to explain to us what is wrong with giving any small bit of quota towards the people that need. I think you need to explain to us that, like, you're good representatives, in fair play to you. You're excellent representatives, you look after your own sector. But you have to have a vision for looking after the discriminated people against the people, less well-off people. That's what we need to do.
Thanks, Deputy. Any other members wish to... Any questions before we went? Okay. We'll start at the back, Deputy O Cuiv.
I'm not a member of the committee, but...
No, but I give but if you want to...
Yeah, just... I think that Deputy Ferris touched on the nub issue here. It's what they call track record. Now, we have to recognise that it was only in the noughties that good ferry services went into all the islands. So if you lived on an island, your chances of being working based out of the mainland was virtually nil. And the second reality is that a lot of the islands didn't have sheltered harbours. Particularly true in the case of Galway, of the two smaller Ireland islands, where there was nowhere you could leave a boat. And certainly up in Arranmore in Donegal, Killybegs, which is the main fishing pier, most people wouldn't call it a pier on the mainland. Tory didn't have any sheltered harbour historically. And therefore, basing fishing on track record on islands, with the exception to a certain extent of Inishmore in the Aran Islands, just doesn't work. And on the other hand, there's one thing certain about an island that's surrounded by water, by sea. And basically what the bill is trying to do, now maybe the bill technically can be amended, and I think we all agree with that. I don't think the proposer of the bill, Deputy Kenny, has any argument with that. But basically, the big scene ticket here is that a very small amount of fishing effort would be made available specifically for those living on islands, so that they don't wind up living in a place that's surrounded by water that they cannot access in a way that is reasonable in the modern world, not at a very large scale. They can compete commercially with very, very large fishermen, but on a much more modest scale, but not limited to what a curragh can do with the very limited permissions that curragh operators have. Because, like everybody else, people want to move a little bit forward and have slightly bigger boats and so on. Now, the bill had a very, very limited length of boat that would be eligible. So if you happen to be on an island and happen to have a very big boat, you wouldn't have benefited from the proposal that's before us. And that was purposely done. I was on the committee that drew up the initial proposal. And I have to say, what I hear here today, looking at the submissions, is, we don't have any problem with this, but, and I always get very worried when I hear that but, because what it means is we wouldn't like to tell you we don't want you to get a share of the thing, but on the other hand, we're going to make damn sure certain you don't. And the final point I'd like to make, on many, many cases, exceptions are made on islands because the state recognises the unique situation of islanders. So, for example, if you live on an island, the pupil-teacher ratio for retention teachers is much lower than it would be on the mainland because there is no going to the next school. The car tax on an island is much smaller in recognition of the fact that most islands only have from a mile to 3 or 4 miles of road. There's an extra social welfare payment on the islands for people on invalidity pension, disability allowance and on state pensions. Again, because it's recognised that you have to bring all of your goods in and pay VAT on transporting the goods in. So the precedent of ring fencing things, especially for islands, is well established in the last 10 or 15 years. And to be fair about it, I'll have to say one thing. Having travelled up and down this island, I have never met anybody who begrudged any steps we took in this Oireachtas to try to preserve viable populations on our islands. And so many people on the mainland get it. Ordinary people in cities, in towns and in the countryside get it, that if you want to preserve the islands, you have to do something special. And finally, can I say this? Issues frustrate me when I hear so much talk about the Blasket Islands and the culture that was there and Tillonach and all the rest, and it's fantastic stuff. Peg Sayre, I mean, what was there was unique and it's pity. But some days we don't seem to be half as concerned about the fact that that same culture, that same language, that same literary bent is still alive in places like the Aran Islands and Ullum, Torre, and that it's there. And will we be crying after them when these islands are decimated and when the indigenous populations are gone out of them and the language is gone? Will we be crying and say, why didn't we do something small for them to keep them viable? And that's all we're asking.
Thanks, Deputy. Now, witnesses, I return to you. Start at the back with Deputy or Mr. O'Donnell first of all.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Deputies. If it's okay with Deputy Ferris and Deputy Kenny, can I sort of, some of your questions sort of crossed over, and I'll sort of give you my thinking and my views on it. You've nailed your colours very clearly to the mast, and I respect you for that. I suppose my difficulty is that, I mean, and my colleague said it as well, we represent people that come from disadvantaged areas, and we also represent people that have done very well in the fishing industry. And how do you disentangle somebody from an island and somebody who's fishing right beside them in the same area and who's extremely disadvantaged as well? For, you know, they may not have any work. If you're from southwest Donegal, you're going to have absolutely nothing in terms of employment other than fishing or a little bit of subsistence farming. And there's no question about it, government can change policy. I mean, they've changed policy lately around mackerel sharing, they changed policy on blue whiting a number of years ago, they changed policy on Celtic sea herring and on northwest herring a number of years back as well. And I suppose this, in the last number of years, there is a scientific fishery for northwest herring, and I suppose last year the inshore vessels got approximately 15% of that, not all under 12, I would say, some under 12, but some in the 14, 15, 16 metres, and some of those people are from islands as well. So there is a recognition at PO level and at policy national level that more has to be done. But I just do not know personally, wearing my own PO hat, or even looking at politically, you know, how you can differentiate between people. But I do respect what you are thinking and what you are saying, because there's no doubt about it, people from islands, they can't just step off and get a job. But in some coastal communities, they can't go elsewhere either, okay? Just to say that, and how, you know, there's no doubt about it, the CFP recognised island communities and small-scale fisheries more so this time than it's ever done. But it recognised it, but it didn't really direct, you know, how that was to be actually played out. And definitely the European Fisheries Fund, the EMFF is there. I think that a lot more money needs to go into small-scale fisheries in general, not necessarily just island communities. When I think of small-scale fisheries, I think of everybody that's fishing inside the baselines, in terms of fisheries management, in terms of science, in terms of nursery areas, in terms of marketing, in terms of infrastructure on islands, in terms of infrastructure around piers. So just to say that, in maybe it might help your thinking, we're not in the same place, but I do recognise that needs to be done. And as I said, government can change policy. And just Deputy Conneely, I talked about salmon fishing. I did, because salmon fishing, in a previous life, I was a fishery inspector. Salmon fishing ceased, drift netting for salmon in Ireland in 2006 after a task force. It was perceived at that point that drift netting for salmon was the reason for the decline of Atlantic salmon. It's now accepted that that wasn't the case. Atlantic salmon have continued to decline. They think it's a marine survival issue. And just why I said that, I think it's important that traditional fisheries such as drift netting, draft netting for salmon, you know, the environment changes, ecological conditions change in Greenland, Iceland, where salmon go to feed. There may be a time in the future, 10, 15 years out from now, the salmon stocks start to recover, and I think that it's important for coastal communities to be able to exploit them. I know that, you know, they're an iconic species, but I think if managed properly, that, you know, if that fishery comes back on stream, that opportunity should be there. And I suppose that it should be there for everybody. Families have traditionally fished salmon from islands, from coastal communities, and I suppose it was something that my member said to me, look, you know, will a heritage licence confer rights if salmon fishing comes back? And I said, well, it's something, I said, I'll put it into our submission, but I'm just saying that I would be very open to it, as somebody who comes from the coast myself, that we would monitor that fishery into the future, and that, you know, there would be a willingness at government level if stocks did recover, and you know, it's probably difficult to know at this stage if it will happen, but that we should be open to actually opening up those fisheries again. So, and just Deputy O Cuiv, he talked about track record. Yes, that is the case in some fisheries, but that's up to government. It's up to elected representatives within their parties to push that, to change that. And that is very much in flux. And it has been changing, and maybe not always, I suppose, in the favour of the inshore sector, but it definitely has changed in the last 2 to 3 years. And government policy, I do know, is to try and give more to the inshore sector in terms of pelagic stocks. Maybe it may not be happening fast enough, but that is happening. So, and that's up to you guys. I can't even change that. That's up to elected reps.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Donnell. Ms. Parks next, and I'll just go around there. Ms. Parks.
Thank you. Well, I would just like to again direct my first replies to Deputy Ferris and Deputy Kenny. We're arguing the same thing here, but from different perspectives. I am very much against putting something in place that actually, at the end of the day, does not make any difference, does not improve the lot of people living on islands. And I'm afraid that that is my impression of what you're saying. That would be the outcome of this bill as it stands at the moment, because you could create a quota for islands way in excess of any fishing opportunities they have at the moment. And if they haven't got those islands haven't got the infrastructure to translate that into sound economics, they're not going to be any better off than they are at the moment. You have to stop and think, what is the extra quota going to do? I mean, why are islands already not able to avail of what quota is there? You know, for instance, like the mackerel and the amounts that are available in blue whiting and herring and so on. You know, why is that happening? It's because there is no infrastructure for them to do it. There is, or you're shaking your head, but
that's certainly not, as far as we're concerned, the reason they can't get the quota is because they haven't got the track record, and they can't get the track record because they can't fish. So it's a catch-22. That's our information.
Back into some of them.
No, sorry. There are fishing opportunities there that there is no track record attached to, such as the tonnage for inshore fisheries for mackerel, just as an example, which is about 50% availed of at the moment. Now, I know that to a certain extent the island fishermen probably wouldn't be that interested in it, because what do they do with it? They go out, they catch it, and you land it on an island, and what are you going to do with it then? It's going to at best perhaps be used for bait for crustacean fisheries. So these are the things that I think are underpinning the sustainability of fisheries for islanders. And so there will be, as I said in my address here, KFO fully supports the concept of special status for island residents, and we would give every bit of support and help that we could in that regard. But it has to make sense. It has to make economic sense. And I think I would feel that we're doing a disservice to islanders if we're not underpinning it with proper infrastructure and whatever is needed. I mean, even I think in the way of information as to what's available. I spoke to some of Donegal islanders knowing that I was coming here, and I was astounded at the number of them who didn't even realise that they could actually go out and fish mackerel. You know, so you know, there's a big information gap here that needs to be addressed. And as I say, we have no problem with boosting up the amount of fishing that the islands are doing. Would be delighted. They would be more than welcome to join the likes of a PO and avail of the services that everybody seems to think that POs can, that the magic wand that POs have as regards getting quota for their members. I wish it were the case, but you know, that we would be more than happy to represent them in those fishing issues. But you know, as my colleague Francis has already said, over the past few years, the opportunities for the inshore sector, including islanders, has improved enormously, and that is a process that has started and will continue. It will evolve and it will become more so. But as regards your concept that we're here as POs protecting the quota that we own, you know, that is nonsense. That is not the case at all.
Okay, Ms. Parke. Mr. Boyle next.
Thank you very much, Chair. Look, we said what we said earlier on about islands and the opportunities that we might have to give them because of this bill over the relatives, neighbours ashore who are actually fishing in the same area. And I'm coming back to Deputy Kenny's unlevel playing field. I worked around every island in Ireland. I fished around every island in Ireland, both in small boats and in larger boats. I know all the islanders, an awful lot of the islanders. I know a lot of the island communities. I worked with, in a partnership with other boats from the Aran Islands for nearly 30 years. So I have knowledge and insight into what happens there. Most of the islanders that I know and have met over the years they're very proud people. They're very independent people. They're very progressive people, and they're competitive. And that can be seen from the islands. The islanders, an awful lot of the islanders, came out. They did what they had to do, had a level playing field at the time, and I'm not going into the track record end of it. This is obviously before it, and were pioneers in the fishing industry. It was an islander, had the first dedicated pelagic vessel in Ireland. They worked their way up to that. They had the first factory ship in Ireland, and the biggest trawler in the world at its time in Ireland. They were from an island. You can go on down to the Aran Islands, you can go to Crete Island, you can go to some of the skippers from the Inishboffin who work on big vessels. They've all done powerful while. You can go to Bear Island and the West Cork Islands. So we're talking about people who have a proud tradition themselves, and I am surprised that they would be looking for anything other than a level playing field. Yes, fishing communities around the coast need I'm not going to help in some way or other, possibly by way of quotas and so on and so forth, but I wouldn't, and I don't think that they would want quota that their neighbour 2 miles away couldn't access. I think I could agree with Norah there that, what quota can you give them? There's very little cod around the islands. There's no haddock around the islands. Inside the 6 mile zone. And I would be surprised if they wanted to confine themselves to that particular area, because the islanders that I know actually wouldn't want to confine themselves to that 6 mile zone around the islands. So, when I talk about islands, I actually live on an island, reared a family on an island, and their family, they're rearing their families on an island. So I have a little bit of an insight into what happens on island, not an offshore island, of course. So, that's where I'm coming from with the level playing field, that the islanders, I don't expect someone to lose out as a result of them getting something extra. If we could go with what Mr. Casey here said, if that could be worked at some stage or other along the way, that'd be perfect. So I have a lot of friends on islands and don't want to lose the friends on islands. I won't lose the friends on islands by what I'm saying, because I know that I've been totally objective here. On Mr. Kenny's other point, ring fencing, yeah, well, ring fencing in the fishing industry is a dirty word, and it's and has been used as such in the past. I'm glad you agree with my observation of that this is a ring fencing, and as Deputy O Cuiv says, look, there's been stuff ring fenced for islands before. Yes, obviously there has. Deputy Ferris's point there of the government can change its rules, it can allocate quota. Yes, probably can. And if it does, we'll not be standing up on a bar and actually saying don't do that if it does that. But the way things are at present, it can't actually do that, and that process isn't available to us at the moment. The track record thing is a difficulty, yeah, it's a difficulty. I admit that the track record is a difficulty. So, there's where we're coming from. But, as I said in my closing sentence there, at the moment, as the bill stands at the moment, we can't actually support it.
Would you amend it?
Thank you very much.
Can I just get one tiny clarification?
No, I'll let you back down a minute. I want to get in Mr. Murphy. He's bited to get in here for a long time now.
Thank you, Chair. As an islander, I would classify myself as an islander. We come from Hare Island. We still have our family home inside there. I started fishing out of Baltimore around the islands. So, like my colleague here, I would have a great interest in the island communities. I was one of the pioneers of setting up a V-notching programme around the southwest coast of Ireland. And here's where the problem is, where I see it. As has been articulated by my colleagues here, currently the law will not allow us to give an individual quota to anybody, right? I learned this the hard way because when we set up the lobster V-notching programme, when we looked for protection for those people who had put a lot of money and time and effort into protecting their own fishery, even though there was a lot of them weren't participating in it, when we looked for a licence for those individuals, we were told that unless they had a fishing boat licence, they wouldn't give a second licence, which was the case with salmon licensing. So here's the crux of the problem. So my colleague here, Mr. Casey, has articulated that there is an actual solution to this. We as a country did not protect our inland waters inside the baseline. We did not give away the fish that swim inside in that baseline to Europe. It's our fish. But Europe count that fish in our overall quota. And I know, Deputy Kenny, that Ireland counts it. Ireland counts it against Ireland's quota that we get from Europe back at around, as was articulated as well, around 10% of the quota. So I do see this as a solution. As an island person, I think there's a fantastic way of looking at this. We can calculate the amount of fish that has been caught in previous years inside the baseline and go to Europe and say, look, this is fish that was logged and caught inside the baseline, but shouldn't have come off Ireland's quota. It was Ireland's fish. We want to do something with that fish now. We have island communities who, as you said, the principle of this is to allow the people of the islands remain on their island homes, access the resource that's around them. And as Hugo has pointed out, there's very little of that resource inside there now at the moment, different types of fish. So you have to look at the economic sense of this, what a fisherman can and use and will use inside an island community. I'm confused by the term, we'll give them 1% off the top. If they cannot access that 1%, is it theirs to trade? Is it theirs to use as a commodity elsewhere? Or if they don't catch it, as Norah has said, will they lose that right of that fish because of the fish that actually swim in the inshore waters around these islands? I will come back. This is why I let this man, educated man, make the proposal to this committee. As legislators of this country, we have a very important job to look after all the communities of the country, including the coastal communities. And there is an opportunity here, and I'll stress this, there is an opportunity here to look at the legalities of whether we can get back the fish within our baseline for Ireland, to do and write the laws, change the laws to accommodate the purpose of this bill. So I thank the Chair. That's what I was trying to get in.
Briefly, Mr. Casey.
Yeah. Chairman, I just want to say two things in relation to kind of splitting islands and remote coastal communities or whatever. Recital 19 of the Common Fisheries Policy says that Member States should endeavour to give preferential access for small-scale, artisanal or coastal fishermen within the 12-mile coastal limit between the baseline and 12 miles out. And then goes on to say small offshore islands which are dependent on fishing should, where appropriate, be especially recognised and supported in order to enable them to survive and prosper. But it doesn't say anything about giving them preferential access in the same way as has been set out in Article 9 or Recital number 19, saying that preferential access should be given for small-scale, artisanal or coastal, which would include island fishermen, I would imagine. The Irish Southwest very strongly supports the principle of what you're trying to achieve. But I mean, if we just take just the experience of two islands, Whiddy Island and Bantry Bay is 45 miles from the baseline. It is 45 miles from the exclusive fishery limits of the state. Bear Island, just outside Castledown-Bear, is almost 20 miles from the baseline of the state. there is, particularly along the southwest coast and along the midwest, from Galway the whole way up to the top of Bangor, or way up to the top of Erris. There's an enormous amount of sea area there. And the fact of the matter is that fish caught in those waters, we submit from the Irish Southwest, are not European fish at all. They're not subject to any quota restrictions. They're not subject to any management restrictions. They're not subject to logging rules with the European Union. And I think that it's time for this committee, essentially, to actually assert the importance of these waters and try to fashion a piece of legislation that will actually seek to confer some sort of preferential treatment to small-scale, artisanal, coastal and island fishermen, making use of these waters which we did not give to the EU and the fish in which we did not give to the EU. So to say, I think we very, very strongly support the principle of it. We think we've mapped out a way that you could achieve this without impinging in any way whatsoever on principles of the Common Fisheries Policy or Ireland Fisheries Law. In fact, you can create an entirely new system to deal with it. That wouldn't, it would be separate and apart altogether from what's already there.
In our consideration of today's proceedings, and when we do a report in this matter, we can take that on board very much, what you're suggesting, you're in feeding back on the actual bill itself. Is that all right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, Ms. Parke, before I... Yeah.
This is an apology. Some of us actually have another meeting that we have to go to.
No,
we didn't realise that it would run on so late.
No, we're going to let you go down 1 minute.
Yeah.
Just...
Thank you all. Just a couple of small points of clarity. First of all, Mr. Boyle, you mentioned an island fisherman who had the biggest boat in the country. How did he get it in on the island if we have no piers on the island? How did he get home at night? it's the first thing. I mean, now, pardon my ignorance. I just wonder.
Just like the rest of these islanders that actually have pioneered fishing. I mean, they came and they lived ashore after.
Oh, he lived ashore. Oh, sorry,
yeah.
Sorry. I thought he was fishing off the island. That was the first thing that struck my mind, because the indication was given that one of the issues that
really
is that there isn't the facilities on the island for larger boats, which I understand. And then you said the largest boat in the country, and immediately I thought the other issue is in regard to, and it was mentioned, I think, by Mr. Murphy, in regard to trading quota. You said the 1% issue, and the 1% issue is something that I think we need to look at, because for much of what I hear about, you're talking about an awful lot. Some of them would only need a percentage of 1%, because that's all the fish that's around the island, and maybe another species at another time that need a little bit more than. So, you know, the 1% is a kind of a ballpark figure that was thrown up there. There would be a tiny amount of quota needed, and that's the reason. So the 1% isn't a real figure as such. But the point which you mentioned was about, would it be traded? And I just wonder, how do you mean traded? How can it be traded if nobody owns it?
You see, if you're allocating it to the islands, if you're allocating it to the islands, then it's their commodity. So if they wanted to trade it off with another fisherman, like it happens in other countries, so like we do swaps.
We're included from doing that in Ireland, are we not?
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. If you're giving it to an island population and they can't fish it, either that's what I meant. Either they let it go dead and they can't use it. It goes back into the pot. That's the complications that Norah articulated earlier on. That there was 450 tons of mackerel that is allocated to smaller boats that they can catch through line or jigging, okay? And as Norah has said, only half of it is used in the year. Well, that goes back into the bigger pot. What I'm asking you is, do you envisage the 1% to be dedicated to the island? So 1% of every fish. As Hugo has, my colleague Mr. Boyle has pointed out, if those fish don't swim in that area, 1% of fish that you cannot catch around the islands is no good to you. So do you swap it for another % of the fish that's inside that area that you can catch 2% of? So that was just a question to yourself that you envisage in the bill. There's huge complications here. There's a misconception, I think, of how the fish is allocated in this country. It's allocated by boat size. Once you have a licence, if you're under 55%, you get 1/3 or half of what the boats in the larger section catch. On a monthly basis, we go through all the stocks and we see what fish was caught in the previous 2 years. We use our own knowledge and our own vessels' knowledge to know how many vessels will participate in that fishery in the next month, and we try and allocate the crumbs, is the word I would call them, on the next month's basis so that all those boats can go out and stay fishing. And that's how hard it is for Ireland to give out fishing allocations to different vessels. If a vessel doesn't catch its allocation, it goes back into the pot for the following month, and we do the same process over and over again. So everybody gets the same. Once you have a fishing boat licence, like I have in a small boat, I can catch, in my category, up to 55%, the same as everybody else. And I choose what fish I can catch, where I can catch it, and how I can catch it and land it. So what Norah was trying to say, if you restrict the licence, like I was explaining earlier on, like the lobster boat licence, like the licence we did for inshore potting, okay? It's a P licence. We brought it in because, like you said, Deputy Ferris, when we looked for a licence for the lobster fishery, we said you don't have a track record. And what happened in 1985? There wasn't a drive to licence vessels under 12 metres in Ireland. So there was an awful lot of boats around there just were fishing, but were never licensed by the state. They never logged them onto the European register. So testament to that is 410 of these boats are in existence today, but they only have a non-quoted species licence, so they can catch crab, like Norah as well had said earlier on, lobster. So if you have that licence, you can catch that, and there's no quota for it. So there's no management structure in place for that. So if you live in an island, you can go put out 200 pots, catch that species of fish, and bring them in and land them. But if you restrict them in the licence that you give them, they may be excluded from that fishery. So my boat, as I said, can catch any species of fish that's allocated on the monthly allocations that we go through on a month-by-month basis, and it's up to me to catch them, up to 50% of the boats in the larger segment.
Thanks, Mr. Murphy. Mr. Boyle, to conclude.
That's probably something for the future and maybe something for you to look at, but we're talking about the bill here. And I think ring fencing was acknowledged on one of the points in the bill, and it says actually in section 6, subsection E, is the introduction of a non-transferable community island quota. In other words, what Patrick is suggesting can't be done just at this minute in time.
Thanks, Mr. Boyle. Okay, I'd like to thank the witnesses in this particular session for your patience and attendance here today, and for your submissions as well. And as I said, we will be reporting on all this in due course. Okay.
Just
very brief.
It's one sentence. I would ask the committee to also take into account the submissions that we have made on behalf of our
I've said that we would. I said all submissions will be taken into account that will be made by all the organisations.
Not just in relation to the inland waters of the state, but also in relation to the issue of whether, in fact, there was...
Yeah, but we're dealing with the bill now initially anyway.
Yeah, but having regard to the affairs of the committee, that's what I was saying.
Yeah.
That our waters between 12 and 200 miles, which were never voted on in a transfer to the EU in respect of the fish resources, and whether that is something that the committee would look at in the future.
Which is something we can take on board.
Yeah.
Very brief now, Deputy.
Thank everybody for their contribution and so forth, and obviously where there's concerns and queries and things like that. But we're open to people sending in amendments. Send in amendments. But what we want to do here is to get this bill passed so that people who are very, very badly disadvantaged will be in a better place. And give us your amendments and we'll have a look at them. Is that fair enough?
Thanks very much, witnesses. We'll suspend briefly, and if we just change that you off and we get in the other witnesses. Thank you very much. Okay, so remind members and witnesses again to make sure the mobile phones are completely turned off, please. This is section B. I'd like to welcome from Conneely and hÉireann Mr. Simon Murray, the chairman, and from the Irish Island Marine Resource Organisation, Mr. Jerry Early, the chairman, and Mr. Enda Conneely, committee member, and from Trinity College Dublin, Dr. Ruth Brennan, marine social scientist at Trinity Centre for Environmental Humanitarians. And thank you for coming before the committee today. First, And also, I'd like to thank you for sending your submissions to our committee. The members have been circulated with these along with your opening statements. As I mentioned in the first session, I remind just my members, our witnesses, the presentations not longer than 10 minutes if at all possible, please, to try and speed up the whole process. Privilege, before we begin to bring to your attention, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect to the evidence you give to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are only entitled to thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary balance to the effect that where possible, you should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name in such ways to make him or her identifiable. Members are reminded of long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that members should not comment on or criticise or make charges against either a person outside the House or an official either by name or in such ways to make him or her identifiable. Now, Mr. Murray, I ask you to make your opening statement, please.
Thanks. We thank the committee for the opportunity to comment on this very important Islands Heritage Licence Fisheries Bill. In 1984, 16 islands formed Comhdháil in hÉireann. As the representative organisation for the offshore islands, our aim is to draw attention to the difficulties facing islanders in all areas of island life, which were not and are not being dealt with effectively either at regional or national level. Our aim is to work to find solutions which are island-proofed. As an example of protecting this way of life, Comhdháil, along with its sister organisation Conneely, have worked with the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine to help island farmers engage constructively with island issues. This work recently led to improved payments under the areas of national constraint, which is now as an islands category, as well as working with island farmers on result-based, locally led schemes for European innovation partnerships. This is an example of island-proofed policies that have helped secure our island way of life. As part of that ongoing work, we are here today to promote the Islands Fisheries Heritage Licence Bill. Comhdháil, along with Conneely, have consistently asked Government to have fishing designated as a pillar of job creation on the islands and appeared before this committee in 2013. Island communities welcomed the 2014 Joint Oireachtas Committee report on sustaining coastal and island communities. We see the Islands Fisheries Heritage Licence Bill as a logical follow-on to the recommendations of the committee, especially Recommendation 10, Heritage Licences. This is a simple and effective mechanism to ensure that fishing opportunities are accessible to small fishing boat owners on islands. Islanders are by nature resourceful and, if allowed to, can make the best use of available opportunities. Small-scale fishing, which is of the greatest benefit to the island communities, is most at risk from policies that promote large-scale industrial fishing. Those who remain fishing in their island communities have been forced to make a living mainly off non-quota species. This is not sustainable for our communities or the fish stocks. The current Common Fisheries Policy recognises the special requirements of small offshore islands, and they are specifically referred to in the Common Fisheries Policy, paragraph 20, that controls European fisheries. Comhdháil is one of the founding members of the European Small Islands Network, ESN, and we work closely with islands across Europe. Through our work with ESN, we keep informed on the special positions of islands all over Europe and of the varied solutions applied to address unique problems. We have the full support of ESN in the ongoing work to get this bill passed into law. To survive, fishing on islands needs to revert back to a system of seasonal fishing and local management, where managed quantities are taken from the various stock quotas at different times of the year. Having our small-scale island fleet return to seasonal fishing practices will add significantly to the tourism industry, which has become an increasingly important part of the economies of the islands. The solution advocated in the Islands Fishery Heritage Licence Bill will allow fishing opportunities in the form of quotas to be allocated by the Minister in order to maximise the benefit of the resource to the maximum number of people. Allocating the necessary amount to the Islands Fisheries community will help to redress the decline. Islands work in a different way to the mainland, a point not lost on the islanders who were lectured to by the mainlanders who have left the room. The current system is simply not working for the islands. We need to act before it is too late. Comhdháil in hÉireann strongly supports the introduction of the bill. Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. Early, you're next.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm joined by my colleague, Mr. Enda Conneely. The Irish Islands Marine Resource Organisation, IIMRO, would like to thank the Chair and the Committee for the invitation to appear and discuss the vitally important Island Fisheries Heritage Licence Bill. IIMRO are a members-based organisation with fishers from the islands of Donegal, Mayo, Galway and Cork, run by and for fishers. It is a member of the Irish Islands Federation and affiliated to the Low Impact Fisheries of Europe, LIFE, which represents around 10,000 small-scale fishers across Europe. Islanders have worked at national and EU level since 2006 to regain traditional seasonal fishing opportunities around our islands. IIMRO would like to direct the committee to our recent submission on the Island Fisheries Heritage Licence Bill for more detailed background and reasoning behind the bill, and would also like to emphasise aspects of the bill here today. The bill is a direct response by lawmakers to a recommendation from the cross-party report on promoting sustainable rural, coastal and island communities published in 2014. IIMRO would like to publicly acknowledge and commend the work of the previous Joint Committee and indeed this committee in working to make the bill a reality. The purpose of the bill is to reallocate a small portion of publicly owned quota to boats on the island polyvalent register to allow island communities co-manage their fisheries and resume a low-impact seasonal fishery from small boats. By allocating public quota in this way, different fish species can be caught at different times of the year as they move closer to the islands and as weather allows. Boats are under 12 metres and use low-impact, non-towed gear, keeping to the principle of the right gear in the right place at the right time. IIMRO are working with a number of partners, such as Trinity College Centre for Environmental Humanities, to co-design and test new approaches that address the needs of fisheries-dependent island communities and meet national and European marine objectives. It is expected that this work will complement the upcoming legislation around the EU Marine Strategy Framework Directive and the National Marine Spatial Plan. The Island Fisheries Heritage Licence Bill represents a chance to change a fisheries policy system that has allowed the nation's publicly owned fishery resource to be concentrated in the hands of a few at the expense of island and other communities whose populations continue to decline. The Irish European Maritime and Fisheries Fund operational programme summary states the Irish fleet is characterised by a high share of small-scale vessels. 64% of the total number of vessels are less than 12 metres, but account for only 2% of the total value landed in 2013. Currently, small-scale vessels on the islands are impeded from accessing the publicly owned quota, resourced by fleet segmentation and layers of rules that include the requirement to have track record in a specific fishery before they can access quota for that species. If a fishing boat did not have catch recorded in certain index years for a quota species, then it does not receive quota thereafter. This despite the fact that boats under 10 metres are not required to log their catches. Typically, these are the most valuable species and would give island fishers a more diverse and sustainable income source instead of the non-quota crab and lobster that make up the bulk of the catches at present. A list of quota species relevant to the islands make up part of IIMRO's submission, and the committee will note that it does not include salmon, which is not a CFP quota species. IIMRO have worked hard with public representatives across Europe and here at home over a long period to ensure that the provisions of the bill comply with the letter and the spirit of the CFP Common Fishery Policy and other relevant legislation. Director General Machado of DG Mayor confirmed at a meeting with IIMRO members in 2015 that it was agreed that quota assignment is a matter of the national authority and that any allocation for islands within the national quota is not contrary to the Common Fishery Policy. The Common Fishery Policy regulation recognises that islands need to be especially recognised and supported in order to enable them to survive and prosper. Our neighbours across the water in Scotland have recently passed a historic Islands Bill at the end of May this year, and islanders here are encouraged by the cross-party support which our own island fishers, the Heritage Licence Bill, is receiving. IIMRO are committed to continue working with the Government, other political parties and the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine to make sure that the Island Fisheries Heritage Bill is the best possible legislation for our island communities. We ask the committee members to keep the momentum going so the bill can become law. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Mr. Rarity. Finally, Dr. Brennan.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you very much for the invitation to address the committee today. I'm a marine social scientist from the Trinity Centre for Environmental Humanities in Trinity College Dublin. For the last 12 years, my research field has been marine environmental governance. My approach is to identify, support and encourage marine stewardship and co-management within local communities as a means of ensuring effective governance of the marine environment. I support consideration of the Island Fisheries Heritage Licence Bill, as I believe it has the potential to contribute to meeting our national, European and international conservation objectives for the marine environment, while at the same time providing much needed support for our island-based fishing communities, for whom fishing is important not just economically and socially, but also culturally. I would like to highlight the following. Firstly, the bill responds to and aligns with calls from a variety of committees and policymakers at national, European and international levels to support resource-dependent island communities. These include the already referred to cross-party Oireachtas Joint Subcommittee on Fisheries in 2014, particularly Recommendation 10 that we've heard about. At a European level, the Common Fisheries Policy, and internationally, the FAO voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries. Secondly, the European Commission has expressly called for Europe's small-scale fishers to take the initiative. On the 15th of May this year, only last month, I attended a Fisheries Committee meeting in the European Parliament. At that meeting, Commissioner Vella expressly commented that supporting and helping small-scale fishers is a priority for the Commission. He observed that although Member State quotas tend to end up in the same hands each year at national level, and he said this was not in the hands of small-scale fishers, he emphasised that the Commission has no influence over how Member States distribute their quota at national level. As such, he emphasised that small-scale fishers need to help themselves. This bill is an example of an initiative whereby Ireland's island-based fishers are proactively doing just that, and this should be supported. Thirdly, the bill is an important step towards better marine governance. It has the potential to complement conservation measures that are currently in place to protect the long-term sustainability of stocks for the inshore sector, such as V-notching of lobsters and minimum landing size for crab. And this is because the introduction of island community quota access proposed by the bill would enable island fishers to return to a low-impact practice of fishing quota species seasonally rather than fishing non-quota species all year round. Fourthly and finally, the cultural importance of a vibrant fishing industry to our island-based communities needs to be recognised and supported. The bill recognises and supports islanders' strong sense of belonging to the sea. I'd like to share some research on what I mean when I talk about belonging to the sea. In 2011 and 2012, together with colleagues, I carried out research on the shared maritime traditions and beliefs in two island communities with a strong fishing heritage. One was the island of Barra in the Outer Hebrides in Scotland, and the other the Donegal island of Arranmore. Our research suggested that at the heart of these beliefs and traditions was a feeling that is universally potential in human beings, the sense of belonging to a home place, and importantly, a sense of responsibility for that place. The great Scottish Gaelic scholar John McInnes has described this feeling of belonging as a form of emotional energy, encapsulated by the not easily translatable word dúchas in Irish, also dúchas in Scottish Gaelic. Our research described this sense of belonging to the sea, or dúchas na mara, that we found in these island communities, evident from their living knowledge of the sea, from its place in their stories, histories and legends, from how they have made a living from the sea, from how it has helped to shape their conduct and beliefs, and from the changes that technologies have brought to their relationships with it. Our research made visible an older and deeper way of knowing the sea, which is distinct from but complementary to a way of knowing that is largely informed by book learning and formal education processes. Further research that I carried out on the Scottish island of Barra demonstrated that this intangible cultural heritage and local ways of knowing and doing is key to informing co-management processes with policymakers that meet national and European conservation objectives. During the many years of this research, I spent a lot of time and energy encouraging community members on Barra to engage constructively with the policy environment rather than pushing it away, and likewise encouraging Scottish policymakers to recognise the policy value of the island's intangible cultural heritage and local ways of knowing and doing. It really is a breath of fresh air to see Irish island-based fishing communities being so proactive and so constructive in their engagement with the policy environment here, most recently through the proposal of this bill. I urge the committee to grasp this opportunity and not to squander it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brennan. Now, members, Deputy Kenny.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you all for your presentations. There's a couple of issues that I suppose I really want to get to the heart of this, and one of them, and it's a question to all of you, is how the fishing restrictions has affected the island communities. That we have heard from previous witnesses that the fishing opportunities are there in many cases and are not being taken up, and yet, if that were the case, I expect that the report that would have come from the previous committee wouldn't have suggested that there was a need for an Island Heritage Bill, nor indeed would we be here today. So I'd just like to flesh out that a little bit with yourselves in regard to, you know, what is the real situation from people who live on the islands as opposed to people who represent the producer organisations, as to what the impact of the quota system has been and how it has impacted either negatively or positively. Are there opportunities there that are being missed for some reason? Is it about, as has been suggested, that it's really about investment, and it's really about having better marketing and about having better landing facilities and all of that? Or is it simply that the opportunity to fish doesn't exist? Or that the fish that quota is available for don't swim around the islands? What are the reasons why you feel, and certainly, and I know that IIMRO particularly has pushed this considerably, and I want to, at this point, applaud your work in regard to this. We wouldn't be here pushing this bill forward but for the pressure you put on, in fairness. And what I would like to get some feedback in regard to much of the discussion which you heard earlier, which basically, at the end of it all, when you weighed it up, the producer organisations are saying, really, it's not about quota. Quota is available, but the people on the islands need better infrastructure and aren't really taking advantage of what's available to them already, and that this is only going to put another layer of bureaucracy on top of it. And I'd just like to get your response to all of that.
Thanks, Deputy McConnell.
Thank you, Chairperson, and thank you for the very clear presentations, and for all of you for giving your time to this, and also for the advocacy that you have done in terms of getting the bill to this stage, both in terms of your engagement with the previous Oireachtas Committee and also your engagement in supporting and driving forward this piece of legislation. You will have been listening to the previous presentations at the previous session here at the committee, and a number of the speakers during that session indicated opposition to the bill on the basis that they felt it was unfair to inshore fishermen who are mainland based and not island based. So I had put it to them the particular difficulties faced by the islands, and that's the rationale behind this particular legislation. But I'd like you, in your response here, to take the opportunity to outline your view in relation to what was put forward by them, and how this differentiates between island fishermen and those inshore fishermen who are mainland based. I think Dr. Brennan, your presentation is very insightful, and you've obviously spent a lot of time working, and indeed your comparison between your research in Scotland and in IIMRO and the Pacific non-academic heritage in those islands, which isn't always necessarily coming through in the policy. I think that's a particularly good insight for us here today, and it's interesting to see your particular support for this bill as well in terms of how it supports that. I think also, just in terms of your own and also the IIMRO and Conneely, in terms of how you feel this, if it's passed through to fruition, how it will actually impact, and will it actually, how you see it impacting in terms of employment on the island and the practical application of it. How do you foresee that unveiling? And just also, I'm interested in your response to Deputy Kenny's points there in relation to the uptake on current opportunities, fishing opportunities. And one of the previous speakers has indicated the fact that the line fishing for mackerel quota, I think 50 to 60% of that is used on an annual basis. The rationale for that, and your own perspective on that.
Thanks, Deputy Parke Kennedy.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you for your presentations here today. It's a great help to us when we're considering the bill. I just have a question for Dr. Brennan. I just wonder what you're mentioning here that that the bill would enable island fishers to return to a low-impact practice of fishing quota species seasonally, rather than fishing non-quota species all year round. Is that a problem at the minute, or what are the figures like? I mean, is there a fact that there might be some issue of some species being overfished that are non-quota related? And the other thing I was interested in is you've been engaging with the island of Arranmore and Barra in the Outer Hebrides, and I was just wondering how far did you get in relation to your proposal that they should be engaging with the policymakers, and how you proposed that they would do that, and are you measuring any success in terms of your research? The other thing then is the European Commission. You were talking about the small-scale fishers taking the initiative. Is there any other comment that they made in relation to small-scale fishers helping themselves? Were there any other further suggestions as to how that could be the case? Because it seems that it's sort of a David and Goliath situation, as far as I can see.
Thanks, Deputy. Deputy Ferris.
Yeah, Margaret, look, I think what's very evident is a lack of a track record. And, even when you look at it, even if a track record, that's not there, it's discriminating against people who didn't have that opportunity, especially under 10-metre boats, under 10 metres boat, when you didn't have to log catches and so forth. And how can you have a track record? You know what I mean? And they go, but it's really has inhibited any type of fairness in the sector regarding quota and so forth. And you also mentioned that to survive, fishing on the island needs to revert back to a system of seasonal fishing and local management. And seasonal fishing and local management, one of the biggest and most damaging things done to the seasonal fishing side of it was when the salmon fishing finished. And all the pressure came on non-quota species, lobster, crayfish, crab and so forth. So that's what was left. You took away a thing that made it seasonal, and you make it the non-quota species. I know that down my way they're fishing lobsters 11, maybe sometimes 12 months of the year. And it's doing long-term damage insofar as that they have to fish to make a living, and they're very effective to do it all year round. Whereas if you had a quota, an alternative quota or a quota species, you could take the pressure off of that and distribute it more equitably and fairly. You made, Dr. Brennan, you made a point there, a sense of belonging to the sea, and with 3 people there that would be. That live there. I live in a peninsula, and that sense, that is a true word you ever said, that sense of belonging. And a sense of belonging to the sea, part of that is what you grew up in, you worked in, it became you. And when you take away a livelihood from people, which has been done to inshore fishermen, as well as to particularly people in the islands, you're taking away that part of themselves. So it certainly needs to be looked at and addressed. And the purpose of this bill, of which the island community played a huge role. And when I was listening to some of the contributions earlier today, you get a sense that this has been that the island community are against this, and that's not the case. And I'd like those of you from the island communities here, I think you need to come out, say here clearly what the support that there is or lack of support in the islands for this bill.
Okay. Thanks, Deputy. Some specific questions. Deputy Doherty, do you want to make a contribution?
Well, yes, I will just briefly. I'm very interested in the response to Deputy Kenny's question in relation to the concern that some of the producers have for the future of fishermen on the islands, and how this legislation could really prevent or curtail opportunities for fishermen on the island in the future. But while looking forward to hearing that response, I would like to ask, can you explain to me, in your view, what this legislation being signed into law by the President, what potential it could unlock to your island? And I'm not just talking about a couple of people setting off on the pier, but I'm talking about the wider potential in terms of an island which is a small community and the lack of employment opportunities there. If you could, how important do you think this is in terms of the future of the island and the type of direction that you want to see your islands going in?
Thanks, Deputy. Okay, start with maybe Dr. Brennan, please.
Some specific questions addressed by Deputy Kennedy. So, in relation to the first question about the fishing the non-quota species all year round, I'll provide my response to that, but I'd also like to invite responses from my colleagues here. So, from my understanding, the traditional practice would be to fish non-quota species seasonally when you can fish other fish stocks. And yes, from a point of view of sustainability, logic dictates that seasonal fishing does impose less pressure on stocks. So if you are going to be fishing species which traditionally would be fished seasonally, you're fishing them non-seasonally, as in all year round, there is going to be more pressure on stocks, which could lead to overfishing. I can't give you figures on that, but in terms of seasonal and non-seasonal fishing, then yes, that is the case. You also asked me about more detail on the engagement with between local communities and policymakers in Barra. So first of all, it was a different context in Barra. So yes, there was a very concrete outcome to that. So the context that I was working on in Barra was a conflict over the creation of a marine protected area under the Habitats Directive, where many people within the local community were really pushing the policy environment away because they did not want this additional layer of bureaucracy on their already well cared for marine environment. Now this was 6 years of research, so to cut a very long story short, a very unusual co-management process developed from the dialogue which developed between Marine Scotland and key people on the island, which gave local islanders the opportunity to lead the management of the marine resources in terms of leading on the management of that marine protected area. So they were actually funded by Marine Scotland to advise Marine Scotland on the best way to manage that marine protected area, which had been designated on the basis of a scientific case. So how best to manage that marine protected area that was there through the eyes of local people, so that the ways that they had of actually managing the marine environment that weren't necessarily visible within the policy environment could actually be brought in and made visible within the policy environment. So it was a way of bringing the policy environment and local people's ways of knowing and doing together. And Marine Scotland's, in Marine Scotland's words, they proposed that they would be at the table as a co-management partner if invited to be at the table, and that their role was to be on tap rather than on top. So they were really, really valuing the local knowledge and ways of doing of the local community there. In the meantime, Brexit has intervened, so it's a very, very different story now. In relation to your third question, which was whether Commissioner Vella had made further suggestions as to how island communities could help themselves. He didn't. He was talking more generally, and he was responding, I think, to suggestions that the European Commission should be doing something in order to get more quota into the hands of small-scale fishers. So he was making the point that actually it is within the member state competence rather than the European Commission to decide who the quota is allocated to, and in that vein, the small-scale fishers should be taking the initiative to help themselves as well. And then there was one other point that I wanted to respond to, which was Deputy McConaughey's invitation to respond to the opposition to the bill in terms of it being unfair to inshore fishers that are based on the mainland. And it's something I noticed from all the presentations in the first session, that there was a lot of bandying around of the terms equality and equity and discrimination. And I think we need to be very precise about the terms that we're using here. First of all, I think we need to go back to paragraph 20 of the Common Fisheries Policy and think about why it's there, that it specifically recognises island communities and their different circumstances and their need to be especially recognised and supported. And then I think we need to think about, so the reason that that is there is because they are in a different position and they do need this special support. And then I think we need to think about the difference between equal treatment and equitable treatment. And equal treatment means that we treat different people equally, we give them the same thing. And equitable treatment means that we provide a level playing field, which I believe is what this bill is trying to do. And I think to explain this using a visual would be easier. And there was a very good visual that I saw a few weeks ago explaining the difference between equal and equitable. And there were two people who were trying to see a football match over a wall that blocked their view. And those two people were of different heights. One was tall and one was short, but neither could see over the wall. So they were given equal treatment, and they were given two stools to stand on that were exactly the same height. So they were raised up by the same amount. One person could now see over the wall, but the other person couldn't. That's equal treatment. Equitable treatment means that the person who is shorter is given a slightly taller stool, and now they are both able to see over the wall. This is why it is so important to use those terms precisely. And what the Heritage Licence Bill is trying to do is to establish an equitable playing field, and that is why it is speaking directly to paragraph 20 of the Common Fisheries Policy, which is recognising the special support that is needed for island communities.
Thanks, Doctor. It's a very good description of equitable and equal, I have to say now. Mr. Doherty, do you want to come in next, please?
Yeah, we'll share
no problem,
questions that were put forward by Deputy McConnell, by Deputy Ferris, Kenny and Mr. Doherty. And the one that gets me is the impact that it's had on the islands, I suppose, since 2006. I'll base it on. Now, I've been coming here personally from the previous committee, what your colleague Andrew Doyle chaired, and I think this is the fourth, maybe fifth time we've been here, and the one consistent person is Deputy Ferris, because he was in the other committee. In 2006, and it started with a salmon ban, and I must reiterate, this is not about salmon, but this is where it started, and the subsequent restrictions that happened very quickly after that. Since 2006, the impact on, and I can only speak about my island, IIMRO, there's been a 40% reduction in population. The school numbers have dropped from 60 down to 26. The youngest person on IIMRO Island, which is the second highest populated island on the island of Ireland, at the moment, Chair, it's under 400 for the first time in history, but more frighteningly, the youngest child on IIMRO Island is 3 years old. That's the youngest. I was just told, I do a bit of choir work as well with the National School, and I missed the communion this year, and I apologised to the principal, and I says, next year, I says, I'll make it doubly good. She says, there is no next year. We do not have a child doing First Communion. Now, the impact on that side of it is one thing. You take in the impact of the morale that follows on from that is massive, and an emotionally massive issue for me personally, because I've been doing this since 2006. I've been talking in this chamber. We've been fighting this campaign since 2006, and it's bigger than the bill. The bill is a chance to bring back a little part. Will we ever get back to the levels? Absolutely not. But it's a start. And unless we stop the trend of where we're going, and that's why the bill is not just important, it's the life of the islands. And we stand, and I implore to the committee, it's in your hands to whether these islands live or die. Not to me. I'll fight the fight until I can no longer breathe. But it's such a massive, and you know, we've lost a generation of young fishermen. You know, my son, my grandfather, and my father, and I were given a simple way of life. that you learn how to row a boat, you learn how to fish, you learn how to crew the lifeboat, you learn how to be an islander. I have a son who's 18, 19 years of age, and he can't row a boat. He can't tie a rope of a boat. That's not his fault. It's not my fault. It's not my grandfather's fault or my father's fault. That's the fault, unfortunately, of the legislators and the government and the previous governments of this country. This bill, even though it's flawed in many ways, and people say we were accused of being discriminatory. That was a new one on me. That one blew me out of my seat, that the island people would be discriminating against the mainlanders. I'm sorry. That was such a ridiculous thing, an irresponsible thing to say, and I want that on record. Mr. Chair, you know, I can't, I suppose, say highly enough how important it is. And I know that the will is here from the committee, and it's just imperative, as far as I'm concerned, that this bill gives us a chance to start building again in some shape or form. And I know Mr. Conneely can take some of the other questions.
Yes, my name is Enda Conneely. I'm based on Inisheer in the Aran Islands, and yeah, I'll address some of the points that came up as I've made notes of them, and some of the issues that have come up. The one I fished in the 70s, and started fishing in Parke, and there were about 30 people fishing on the island then. And there was a community that lived off of that at that scale. At that time, you could go out and catch cod, haddock, ling, all flatfish, sole, you name it, was there. And that is not the case anymore, and we certainly didn't kill them all because we didn't have the capacity to do it. So something has happened. It came up earlier, a way the landings have consistently been going down over the last while since the Common Fisheries policy came in and competency passed to the Commission. But I fished in the United States as well. There's a different regime in place there. They tend to, the area that I fished in was very well regulated. And there was people with very big sticks coming along to tell you that you couldn't do what you shouldn't do, and you generally didn't. A few of the points that come up, the quota is available, but islanders don't take advantage, specifically about the mackerel one. There was 450 tonne of line-caught mackerel theoretically available to the inshore sector. It's, I suppose, if we looked into the whole whitefish quota and how much of that has been taken up by the bigger fleet, we would see issues there as well. But there are a few things. One is some of the people that fish on the islands aren't fully aware of the existence of this. Secondly, we're restricted to weather and market. And this is to where it goes. Now, there is I would say that once we do have access to a quota, you can't redress this whole thing overnight. This bill is a step, and there are maybe flaws in it that were pointed out, like about how quota is a public facility to be distributed by the minister for the most good of the most people. And judging by our colleagues earlier, that doesn't seem to be the case. The quota seems to find its way into the bigger operators. We are stuck in this area on islands with this idea of scale, which is another problem. Then something that came up earlier as well about the islanders who had the first RSW boat and got the biggest boat in the fleet and all that, one of the things that they all had in common was that they had to leave the islands. This came way back to when the 50-footers came in, back in the 60s, 50s. If you got a big boat, you had to leave the islands. So people chose not to go in that direction, and they fished the smaller boats. As that's generally the form. If you scale up, you leave. And that's the thing that we don't want to do. We're trying to keep an island community. So the fishing opportunities that we would be allocated by the minister allocates these. They wouldn't be ours. They can be, the opportunity is granted. We would have a structure in place, which we do. We're a member-based organisation. We have input into the advisory councils on that are part of the Common Fisheries Policy system. We have input there because we are on the Transparency Register. We're a member-based organisation, and we have structures in place to actually deal with any of this thing. We are now, hopefully, if we do get access to this thing, we are in the process of setting up a producer organisation for ourselves, for our own system. So at a smaller scale, this is about scale. It seems to be, that's where we are small, and if you scale up, you leave the island, and that's not what we want to do. Another, I'm trying to go through the points as quickly as I can. Yeah. This thing about the unfairness to our neighbours. Well, I'm from Inishere. We fish, our islands are very close together to Inishman and Inishmore, and to the people in Dublin and County Clare. So we've worked with them down the years. We find that the inshore sector in Dublin are also restricted to non-quota species. It's just the way it seems to have developed, and this would go a step towards redressing that. And that thing about equality versus an equitable system sounds very good. When I go back again to this is from our interaction with the Commission. They pointed out that the allocation of quota was an issue for the member state. In Ireland, it's up to the minister, could decide that we will this year allocate X amount of quota to the island fishing boats. The boats that we're talking about are generally small, under 12 metres. A lot of them are 5, 6, 7 metres. They would be in the polyvalent general register anyway. They're on the islands. They would this would facilitate them getting involved in a managed fishery and a managed area, because we see that if everyone is stuck with crab and lobster, they won't support everybody. And there are no restrictions coming in on non-quota species. We look also at the Marine Strategy Framework Directive coming down the line and spatial planning and all that. We would be very interested in a co-management situation. We, on Inishere, work with the Queen's University, the Marine Institute. We had worked with GMIT. We were doing a V-notching scheme for lobster that is tracing the genetics of the lobster. We're into the 7th or 8th year of that now, and that's very important for managing the lobster fishery. But you need to have some kind of management structure in place on that. And one of the things that you need is that the islands have to have an input into that, and the people who are living on the islands. One of the points that was made earlier is that some of the members of the bigger organisations were from islands, and they're still connected to their roots on the islands, but they're not living on the islands. Once you scale up, you have to leave. Inishmore was slightly different in that they had better harbour facilities. I'm trying to figure if there was anything else. This concern that it would prevent the development of the industry on islands in some way. Well, essentially, this bill has created enough red herrings from everybody that we need a special quota allowance for them if many more of them come into the chamber. There's, I don't know how, this is an allocation of fishing opportunity. If you scale up, you leave the island. We're not interested in scaling up. We're interested in managing the fishery around the island so that the fish will be there and spawning areas, all those things. And we would work with anybody to make that happen. We're also looking at something that came up about the 6 mile limit. We're working within the 6 mile limit because that is a competency of Ireland. And under the current Common Fisheries Policy, which we have to work with at the moment, regardless if this new scheme that has come up about the baseline is investigated further, but that essentially doesn't have anything to do with us. It has to do with where we are at the moment. And we are within the 6 mile limit, which is an Irish competency, which means that the Minister here can decide, or this committee can decide. And all this thing has been approved in this particular piece of work. And that has gone through all the relevant legal people, departments, and everyone signed off on this before it came into there. So when we saw that, we teamed up with our neighbour islands and Donegal, Kerry, and we said, this is great. We can now start promoting this for our islands, and we continue on with that. Somebody has to remind me whether I've forgotten something, because I'm...
Okay, we go back again.
Yeah, I'll go back again.
Okay. You okay? Mr. Murray?
I suppose in the role of Chair of Comhdháil and hÉireann, our role is the representative organisation. And to touch on what Jerry said earlier, we're responsible for advocating for a lot of issues, you can imagine, in relation to island life. But they're all pointless if you don't have a population. So, given it's 100 years since a lot of things over the last year, 2 or 3 years, 100 years ago there were about 15,000 people living on the Irish islands across about 60 islands. And now we're under 3,000 and we're under 20. So when you lift the rug on Irish society, and there's been a lot of that over the last 20 years, and especially in the last couple of weeks as well, but there has been a consistent failure over the last 100 years in relation to the protection of islanders living on the islands. And we're talking about species, but this could be a very rare species here you're looking at if something doesn't happen in the not too distant future. Because, and this is part of all of the work that we are about, and that is to try and convince, through this committee and other committees and through respective governments and elected representatives, that this country has islands, you know, and it's an island nation. You'd think it would be one of the few places in the European Union that would be actually happy to have offshore islands, but living on islands, I think we found it a struggle. That's the long and short of it. A constant struggle, as opposed to, and you think of what islands are of each particular county, Donegal, Galway, Mayo, Cork. They're serious economic drivers in each of those counties, and for revenue in general, especially in relation to tourism. And through this bill, which I would hope becomes law in the not too distant future, if that anchors just a handful of communities across the islands, that makes a huge difference. As Jerry said earlier, when you heard about the numbers going into decline, we're trying to hold on to what we have, not allow it to get worse, and anything, and this is a huge part of it, that we can achieve through this committee and through this department, because agriculture did something which was very effective across the islands, and that was the increase in the ANC payment, which was a major benefit to island farmers. So to continue to save our islands, basically, that's what we're here to do. And this fisheries bill is, for us, the heritage licence bill, is a huge spoke in that wheel. And that's the overarching concept of everything we're about. The two lads here, Jerry and Enda, can handle all the technical details if you have any more questions on that. But the bottom line is, we either want our islands and we want to cherish them, or we just want them to continue to disappear, because that's what's been happening over the last 100 years. And we need, I think, a huge effort at this stage, and a recognition, and maybe a change in the psyche of government buildings about where islands are in relation to our heritage and our culture in this country's history.
Thanks, Mr. Murray. Deputy Kennedy, you want to?
Yeah, a few short comments. Yeah, okay, yeah, certainly. Thank you all for your answers to the questions. I just, one of the things I'm still confused about, and you know, I'm learning even now with some of this. One of the things that was mentioned and I asked, I think it was Patrick Murphy about it, was about trading quota or trading, that there was some trade-off. He talked about trading, and before he left I spoke to him again about it, and he said that within the POs, sometimes if a PO has an amount of quota that its fishers are not able to use, they trade it with another PO somehow or other. And I just wonder what experience is there, that we talked about the 1%, think this 1% of quota would be needed by the islanders, that there's some of the, for instance, if it was 1% of mackerel, or if it was 1% of herring, or if it was 1% of something else, that on a particular island it may not be used or be needed. And how would that, can that be traded off? Does that happen? Is there some kind of trading going on with quota? I just wonder about that. The issue in regard to the overall stuff here, the EU has, I think it's 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and Sustainable Development Goal 14 is about protecting our waters and as a natural environment. And to me, while this bill is going about, you know, providing an opportunity for fishermen to make a living, it has that other aspect of it, where it is also about protecting that environment, because the custodians of that environment are going to be the fishermen, and they're both the ones that live on the shoreline, the small-scale fishermen that live on the shoreline and those that live on the islands. And if we can do this, if we can produce this piece of legislation to work for the islanders, and I fully take on board that, you know, it was said earlier on from the producer organisations that they have similar issues with the small-scale fishers that live on the mainland, on the shore. Some version of this may work for them later on. But I think as a model, we have to try and do something, first of all, for the most clean-cut sector that we can find. And I think the cleanest cut sector we can find are those that live on the islands. The issue that was raised, and it's raised a few times at different ones, and I think it's possible, Chairperson, that at some stage when we get through this, that we will have to look at putting a number of amendments in to clarify issues in regard to the bill, to clarify that, you know, the licence, the heritage licence, is about getting a portion of quota, and that the only people who will be entitled to get that portion of quota are people who already have a fishing licence for a fishing vessel. There's probably stuff that we need to do as well about the rules regarding about how to qualify for a heritage fishing licence and how to maintain that fishing licence, and if there's needed to be sanctions put in place. Now, my understanding is at the moment, in respect of the rules that are around this, that the producer organisations have some of the capacity to implement or set some of those rules at present. Is it the intention, and I'm just putting this out there, is it the intention of IIMRO, and you mentioned that you were trying to develop into a producer organisation of yourselves in your own right, is that your intention, that you would be the agency who would distribute this quota, manage this quota, look after this quota, and ensure that it is done for the best interests of the island fishermen? Is that your intention as we move forward, if we get this bill through? Or would you see it as something that will be done by others? That's just one of the simple questions, because I always feel, you know, that where possible, you should try and put the power to help people in the hands of the people that are in need of that help, rather than it being coming from somewhere else. So I just like your views in respect of that. The big stuff and the big stumbling block here seems to be that some sectors feel that by doing this, we set some precedent, which is a bad precedent, that we are in some way moving a piece of quota into private hands. And I'd just like to get your views in regard to that. That, you know, as an island community, do you consider the island community, how many islanders you said there was it, how many at the moment living on the, just under 3,000? That somehow or other that island community doesn't deserve some sense of special space because of the impact and the way that the environment around them puts them in the position they're in. So I'd just like to get your views around that.
Thanks, Deputy Ferris.
Yeah. I think the general public out there are not aware of the huge decline of the population on our islands, the hardships associated in trying to scrape out a living there, and also the very fact that we probably are the most discriminated sector in our society. And this bill, or this heritage bill, if it gets through, will go some way to focus attention on the future of our islands. It's not going to turn things back as it was, but it's certainly going to put a focus of attention on it. And also it will give a sense of, I believe it will give a sense of confidence to those people who reside in the islands that at least they're being heard. And by being heard, that it gives them that sense that you know, they're no longer alone. And I can't understand, when I hear other organisations and on about it will, you know, that it is how we distribute it, all these obstacles that are being put up. For what reason? I can't understand it, that some of them who probably lived in the islands themselves, I just can't understand how they could have any sense of objection towards doing something right for our island communities. I was slightly encouraged at the end of the meeting because many of them came up and they said they agreed in principle. So if the problems they have, they need to give us the amendments to see can we debate those amendments, and if there is merit to them, they should be included. But I just want to say one thing, that it's good being here, listening to you. It's a pity the rest of our nation are not listening to you, because you've been done a terrible wrong. You've been neglected, you've been abandoned, and you've been forgotten about. But maybe today, and maybe as we try and progress this, it will be some awakening in the future for the great culture, the great heritage, the great people that come from our islands.
Thanks, Deputy. Deputy Ryan, you want to make a contribution?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And very much appreciate, because I'm not a member of this committee, and that's why I've been in and out. And I just want to commend the committee. I think the length of the hearings today and the opportunity to hear the issues is really commendable, and shows that this new politics sometimes does actually work. And I hope the bill we support it at the second stage, and will very much support trying to get it through to the Dáil in the remaining time in this Parliament. I just have a couple of questions. I was watching on the monitor some of I heard Enda's and Jerry's contributions, and was very glad to come down and hear the rest of it, and indeed Simon Murray, who I know from Boffin, which I know well. I have just two questions in a sense, if I can. And I heard you saying there that the key issue, you're looking to set up a producer group, and obviously the key issue is route to market. In terms of if we're moving to and I know very much from experience the nature of the fisheries and how it is kind of dominated now by non-quota species, crab and lobster, whatever. If we're moving back to quota species for the likes of the island fisheries, have you looked at the business model as to actually how, given that it's not going to be this big scaled model that they're doing in Killybegs, where's the business? Is there a good example? I always remember thinking at Cornwall or other places there were some examples of other fisheries where they've got small scale quota species where you've got a clear route to market and a good price and a stable and the reason I ask that is because, I mean, for the likes of Inisheer, we get that right, it's important, but I would imagine if you get it right it also helps Dublin, because they're in a sense peripheral too, and a similar type fishery. Or similarly in Boffin, Simon, if we got it right in Boffin, I don't see how it wouldn't help Cleggan as well, in terms of they have a similar difficulty in terms of lack of distance. They don't have the resources of the Castletown Bear or the Killybegs. So if there's a business model that works for Boffin, I don't see why it shouldn't help Cleggan too. And the last question, I missed Ruth's presentation earlier. I look at the monitor to see it there on the recording. But when it comes down then to dealing with quota species, I mean, obviously you have some pelagic coming in and coming out, but I mean, I know from just even knowledge of waters around Boffin that they're starting to see maybe that there are pockets there of local cod species or whatever, which maybe could be the source of a sustainable fisheries. Have you any model of where if a local fishery, if an island is going to kind of come back to have a sense that ability, how do we stop it in the first day wiping out a local cod fishery or whatever? Is there a good example of husbandry of kind of such stocks? I mean, there was for years, for hundreds of years, probably in Boffin, in Inisheer, they were fishing. But the tackle then and the equipment, I mean, there's some small boats I've seen coming out of small harbours that actually, with the power now on a boat and even at less than 12 metre, you could still wipe out what in the past might have supported, as you said, and the 30 fishermen on Inisheer could probably be done now with the fishing effort of 1 or 2 vessels. So how do we develop a sustainable model for some of those quota catches that would support, maybe it probably won't be 30, but if it was 10 or 6, that would have a tremendous effect, I know, and a tremendous, just to finish, what Tom Murray says is so true, that the knock-on effects in terms of the tourism benefit for the whole county or for the whole area is massive. Even having that indigenous industry changes the nature of tourism. You're going not just to a tourist destination, you're going to a place that's carrying on a tradition and developing a new sustainable tradition that would make it an interesting place to go to in its own right, as well as being special places for a whole range of other reasons. So I'm sorry for jumping in and having been out, but I just have a particular personal interest and agree with Deputy Pearse. This is important for everyone. I'm a TD Dublin based south, but you scratch a dub and you'll find someone who actually is interested in the west coast of Ireland and the west coast islands particularly.
Deputy O'Keefe now, briefly, finally, before you wrap up.
Very brief. I'm sorry, I was in Donnell. It was a kind of busy afternoon around the house. First of all, tough fighter of Winton and Oileáin. And I would just like to reiterate what I said earlier. You're sitting there on an island, you have very limited resources, and you've got land, you've got tourism, and you've got the sea. And it always seems to me to be crazy that controlled fishing, and I accept what Deputy Ryan has said, it has to be controlled. You can't have a situation that the boat might be small, but it's a huge, powerful ability to fish and hoover up. I think there's a huge industry to built out of this, because I think what we're seeing more and more with food is people want to know where it comes from and that it genuinely is local food. You hear a lot of restaurants say all the food is local. Sometimes I wonder. In this case, you can really connect it, certify it and get the extra cost. I would just like to say I've been reading Dr. Brennan's statement here, and I think you hit the nail on the head about something that's often forgotten about human beings, and that is there are things in people's heritage. Some people love fishing, some people love horse racing, some people love whatever. But what I have found is that, if I go to rural communities, you'll find people who are attracted to farming, to cattle, to whatever was in the family, even though they have other better ways of earning a living in an objective sense of money. But not everything in life is money. And I definitely think that one thing that is inbuilt in an islander by definition, or in a lot of islanders, not all, but a lot of them, is a love of fishing, a love of the sea, and a knowledge, a very, very deep knowledge that cannot be acquired in a book, as you've said here, duchas. And I think it's important to recognise that yearning in people to access those things that were accessed by the people before them in a sustainable way. And I believe we have to factor that into our thinking, that not everything in life is pure economics. And finally, when I went to the west of Ireland back in 1974, I was meant to be a farmers' co-op manager. And I very quickly came to the realisation that in the kind of land we had in the west of Ireland, you would not sustain vibrant young communities purely on the land. And we developed a different model, and that was that every household had various sources of income, and it also meant that you were less vulnerable to changes, to short-term unemployment and so on, because there was something to fall back on. And that was a job, a day job, a farm, and some tourist income. And when you combined the three together, you had a very, very sustainable family income, if I might use that old-fashioned term, where neither one of them would have given an equivalent to a modern income on its own. I think we often overlook the importance of small-type fishing, even though 80% of our fishermen are small fishermen, and of small-type farming, to give that supplemental income to make the difference between being breadline and actually have quite a reasonable standard of living, taking into account that if you've got a house in your own land, it is cheaper than having to buy a house on the open market. And therefore you can create viable communities that way, where you won't if you try to make sure or try to limit each household to one source of income. These areas are particularly open to the idea of 3 or 4 sources of income into one household, creating a sustainable family. If we don't give access to the sea, that's not possible.
Now I'll ask you to sum up, but I'll ask Mr. Early maybe to address a couple of specific questions regarding managing the quota and setting precedents. I think that maybe Deputy Kenny may have started ask there first of all, and then I'll ask Mr. Murray and Dr. Brennan to wrap up.
Yeah, well obviously managing the quota is dependent on getting the quota. The run in conjunction with the heritage licence, we're looking to set up a PO, and the PO would then manage the quota and transfer as the POs that were in earlier. It's pretty standard. So again, it's a work. It's a work in motion, and it's something that we have to build on ourselves and almost learn again, which is almost, we'll go back to the start, to take a step back, to take a step forward. I think Dr. Brennan's experience and what she done in Barra in particular is invaluable, and I think her expertise is huge. I think we have to use people like Dr. Brennan to find our fit again and advise us all, because I mean she's been there, bought the ticket. I would like to say that what Mr. Ferris said, Deputy Ferris says, is kind, but it's also, the reality is that we are where we are, again, not by choice, but by legislation. And I think that through the chair, I think we have a fantastic opportunity. And I do believe that the committee believe in this. I think they want to help. And I hope going forward that we can find a way that we can get back a part, as Simon said, part of what we lost, to stop the bleeding and move forward. Do you want to take?
Yeah, there's just a few things that keep cropping up. This idea of a private quota, that's not in the frame at all. I don't know where it came from, probably by the name of the bill or licence or something. The quota is allocated by the Minister to the fishing fleet, and the quota that would be allocated to us would be to the polyvalent fleet on the islands that already exist. And then we would hope, we do have co-op structures in place at the moment where we would be able to manage that, but we do hope to have a producer organisation set up fairly soon to deal with that. That would have to do with markets and things like that as well. We're looking at a few things that come up there. Scale. Deputy Ryan mentioned the route to market, the business model that you would be using, and the business model that the likes of the KFO and the other bigger operators would be doing. They would be a scale model. We're looking at a smaller scale, short routes to market, very There are situations, and we're aware of people in Galicia, for instance, who have worked with fishers to put together marketing systems like that at a local level. We're familiar with people in Cornwall that are doing that. There are apps available now for people that you can actually sell the fish that you catch. You don't have to catch it. You stop catching it when you can't sell your catch. So you leave it in the sea. You just take what you need. These things are possible with technology. I mean, there's that's where we're working at. Actually, what you mentioned about if Inisheer pulls ahead with this and gets a good system in place, it can be replicated into Dublin. It's one of the things that we can do with these things. This is an island is a very contained unit, so it's an ideal opportunity to test this model of how we do things. And we're looking at a scale that is small, manageable, and if we make any mistakes or errors or figure out a better way of doing it, we'll do it at a scale that is doable. And in a year or two, it took us 30 years to get here, going down. We're not going to go back up by magically being given access to fish, but we need to access to start building gradually up. We build a marketing system, everything that Deputy O'Cuiv has said there about how island communities and coastal communities, rural communities work. Everything is interlinked. Tourism needs the fishing to happen, otherwise you'll be importing pangasius from somewhere and serving it in Inishbofin or in the Aran Islands. That's not what we want to do. You need the whole thing is interlinked. The small bit of farming, a small bit of fishing, a small bit of tourism, and the scale is an issue. There seems to be a mad rush within the system that you have to scale up everything. Even on the world stage, Ireland isn't a scale economy as such. We should be more, even as a country, looking at where we get value as opposed to rushing to a simple marketing thing of scale up everything and make it in China and sell it to somebody. You need to have, you're dealing with a resource here that's a diminishing resource. It's a finite resource. The sea, we do have the technology now, especially at the industrial level, that we can kill every fish in the sea. So we do have to start bringing back these things from all the inshore area is mainly spawning ground. I'm aware of one fishery in the late 80s, early 90s where somebody got a market for herring roe, and they targeted the spawning herring to such an extent that they haven't really recovered yet. So you can't do that kind of stuff. It's not this scale that we're working at is not a market-led thing. If you get into a big boat, you have all sorts of problems. You have to kill more fish. There are no more fish, so you have to manage this thing. So that's where we have gone, so we want to crawl our way slowly back. We can do this with this bill. Now, there will be amendments, I assume. There are legalities and things that can be done, but even the people that were in today were all in principle in favour of doing something for islands, but their interpretation of this seemed to think that it was going to be privatising quota. Well, that's impossible. It's not. The minister allocates it to a certain group like he does with everything else. It's just that we as islands, recognising that article or paragraph 20 and article 17 and all that, we do it. Is there I am conscious of us being here all day, and you have given us an awful lot of time. So I think that we thank you all for all that. And if we missed anything, you know where we are. Absolutely. We're stuck on islands.
Yeah. Mr. Murray, I'll ask you to sum up, and then I'll go back to Dr. Brennan to finish up.
To sum up where we are is, as islanders, we're here anyway. None of us are going home tonight. That's the first thing, because we live in islands, to make an obvious statement. So we are completely different to our mainland counterparts in many ways. And this bill will help us in securing the future of our islands. I suppose from a representative organisation's point of view, the obvious thing would be to ask, say, the people that are in attendance here. I mean, all of you, I'm sure, can name, a depopulated island, some of them very famous. I'd ask you, can any of you name a repopulated island? Well, the answer to that is no, you can't, because there isn't one. And that's the problem. So once the lights go out, they're not going to come back on. And that's where we are at this moment in history. Ironically, I can sit on Inishbofin with 30 megs, with the world at my fingertips. There's been people in Boffin for 5,000 or 6,000 years. But this generation, and for the next 50 years, is probably the most knife-edge time for Islanders' futures. So I would ask you strongly to support this bill.
Thanks, Murray. Dr. Brennan, to conclude.
To conclude, yeah, I just wanted to address Deputy Ryan's question, a very good question on, you said, how do we, if quota species are now going to be fished under the bill, how would we stop it wiping out, say, a local cod fishery, and are there models which can do that? And you also raised the point that fishing gear, even if it's on small boats, modernised fishing gear has a much greater capacity to catch fish. So well, the first point I'd like to make is that just because fishing gear is modern doesn't mean that it can't be used to achieve more sustainability. So fishing gear adaptations such as escape hatches in creels, for example, would be a good example of that. But that brings me to the point that I want to make, which I think your questions should force us to reflect on what kind of assumptions we are making that underlie our questions in relation to how we actually frame fishers. So you asked were there specific models that are in existence that could address this, and my answer would be yes, I could look in the literature and find umpteen models which would address this. However, my approach is always to work with the local communities on the ground, to listen to them and to ask them what their approaches are, because they are the people who have this knowledge. And also my approach, coming back to the point on framing, your question about how do we stop it wiping out a local cod fishery, we're automatically framing fishermen with only one identity as individual competing fishermen who are damaging a resource. The approach that I come from is to recognise that all of us have varying identities, and the important identity that I work with always is to support an ethos of marine stewardship, working with fishermen in particular as marine stewards. And if we come from that platform of viewing fishermen as marine stewards of their marine resource, which for islanders they obviously want to do because they want to keep that resource there, and to work with them to use their local knowledge to develop models that actually make sense from a local point of view and that are informed by their knowledge which has been garnered over generations and generations, then I think, yes, we can come up with viable models that will guard against what your worry is. And on that note, also, I would, as a final point, I'd like to note that the European Commission recently awarded me 2 years of funding to actually do this work that I'm describing to you with the Irish Islands Marine Resources Organisation, and they have funded me for 2 years to work with IIMRO to develop innovative governance initiatives that meet conservation objectives at a national and a European level. So to work with developing this marine stewardship ethos to bring together the policy environment, the policy objectives that need to be met with this local knowledge which we need to value and which we need to harness and we need to make visible within the policy environment. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Brennan. And I thank the witnesses who have been here today. It's been a long day for you. Apologies for keeping you so late. Today was the second day of our consultations on this particular matter. I think we've given it a good hearing today, as we did the last day. The committee over the next couple of weeks now will decide on the next course of action with the bill. As is mentioned, there may be amendments, there may be legal issues to address, but the committee will address those issues over the next couple of weeks and we'll move on to the next stage. So again, to thank you very much for your participation here today and for your submissions beforehand as well. As there's no further business, the meeting is adjourned on next Tuesday, the 19th of June at 3:30 p.m. Thank you.